In a quiet room far from the sound of any gun, men in crisp uniforms made a choice that would soon ask thousands of others to walk straight into hell, and the warning that might have spared them was already being set aside. Picture a young Marine, barely 21, sitting on his cot with a stub of pencil and a sheet of paper already smudged from his fingers. His name was Tommy, though that hardly matters now. What matters is the letter he was trying to finish before the lights went out. He kept starting over because he didn't want his girl back in Ohio to hear the nervousness he couldn't quite hide. "It's going to be a short one this time," he wrote. "They say we'll be home before Thanksgiving." He paused, stared at the words, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Tell Mom not to worry." He folded the paper carefully, as if neatness could protect the hope inside it. That same evening, hundreds of miles away in another tent lit by a single bulb, a different kind of conversation was happening. Senior officers leaned over maps that showed a small island shaped like a crooked finger. One of them, a man whose face had grown lined from too many nights without sleep, spoke quietly but firmly. He had seen the latest reports from the fast carriers. The Philippines, the great prize everyone was aiming for, looked far weaker than anyone had expected. Why bleed men on this little coral speck when the real fight might be won without it? The question hung in the humid air. Around the table, heads nodded slowly. The logic was hard to argue with. But logic was not the only voice in the room. Momentum has a sound of its own. It sounds like typewriters clacking in headquarters, like admirals on secure lines explaining why the schedule cannot slip, like the distant rumble of ships already loading supplies. Once that sound starts, it becomes difficult for any single voice, even a strong one, to make it stop. The man who had raised the quiet question knew this. He had spent years learning when to push and when to let the current carry things forward. This time he pushed anyway. He laid out what his pilots had seen, what the photographs showed, what the numbers suggested. The island could be sealed off, left to wither. The larger campaign would not suffer. He finished speaking and waited. The answer that came back was not shouted. It was simply that the plan was already in motion, the forces already committed, the political weight already placed on the scales. Changing course now would create more problems than it solved. Tommy never heard any of that. He finished his letter, tucked it into the envelope, and lay back on his cot with his hands behind his head. Around him other young men were doing the same thing, writing, joking too loudly, or staring at nothing. One of them had already started a small poker game using cigarettes as chips. Another was carefully oiling his rifle even though it had been cleaned that morning. These were not green recruits. Many of them had already seen the worst the Pacific could offer on other islands. That experience should have made them cautious. Instead, it had taught them a dangerous kind of confidence. They had survived before. They would survive again. The new mission was described in briefings as necessary but not especially difficult. The words quick and routine had been used more than once. What none of them could see was the quiet argument still echoing in that distant headquarters. The same admiral who had questioned the plan was now looking at fresh intelligence that only strengthened his case. The enemy on the target island had spent months turning the interior ridges into something far more dangerous than anyone had assumed. They were not planning to meet the landing on the beaches. They were preparing to let the Americans come inland and then bleed them from hidden positions the bombers could not reach. That single piece of understanding changed everything about the coming fight. Yet the decision had already hardened into orders. Ships were sailing. Men were writing letters home promising they would be back soon. Tommy's girl would receive his letter 3 weeks later. She would read it sitting on the front porch steps while her little brother played in the yard. She would smile at the part about Thanksgiving and fold the paper along the same creases he had made. She would not know that by the time the letter reached her, the men who had written similar letters were already learning that some warnings travel faster than mail. There is a particular kind of courage required to stand in a room full of powerful men and say the thing no one wants to hear. It is not the same courage that sends a young Marine over the side of a landing craft into surf that may already be turning red. Both kinds matter. Both kinds are tested in different ways. The admiral who had spoken up had the first kind. He had used it before and would use it again. But in that moment the current of the war was stronger than any single voice, no matter how clear or how well supported by evidence. The plan moved forward because stopping it would have required admitting that months of preparation and the expectations of allies and the pride of commanders had all been built on an assumption that was now in doubt. The young men loading onto the transports felt none of that doubt. They felt the familiar mix of boredom and nervous energy that always came before a landing. They checked their gear one more time. They traded stories about home. One private kept a photograph of his newborn son inside his helmet liner. Another had promised his mother he would bring her a seashell from wherever they ended up. These small, ordinary promises were the real weight they carried. Not the rifles or the packs, but the unspoken belief that the war was finally tilting their way and that this next island would not be the one that broke them. Far above them, in the quiet rooms where maps were studied and cables were sent, the last chance to change course slipped away without ceremony. The admiral who had raised the warning did not slam his fist on the table or raise his voice in anger. He simply accepted the decision and turned his attention to making sure the men who would carry it out had every possible advantage the Navy could still give them. That, too, was a form of courage, the kind that continues to serve even when the larger choice has already been made. Tommy sealed his letter and handed it to the chaplain's assistant who was collecting mail. He watched the small stack grow and wondered, not for the first time, whether any of the words he had written would still feel true when he tried to write the next one. Around him the ship felt alive with the low hum of engines and the murmur of hundreds of voices. Someone was singing softly, an old song about going home. The sound carried down the passageway and mixed with the smell of diesel and sweat and the salt air coming through the open hatches. None of them knew yet how completely the island ahead would refuse to behave like the briefings had described. None of them knew that the warning given in that distant room had been the clearest picture anyone would have of what was coming. They only knew that they had been told to go, and that going was what they had trained to do. The letter Tommy had written would reach Ohio weeks later, long after the first waves had gone ashore and long after the first terrible realization had settled over the men who survived the opening hours. By then his girl would already be wondering why the next letter was taking so long. The war had reached a strange and dangerous moment. Victories were coming faster than anyone had once dared hope, yet the cost of each new step forward was still being measured in the same young lives. In the quiet rooms the arguments continued in lower voices. On the ships the men kept writing their letters and checking their rifles and telling each other the same reassuring stories. Somewhere between those two worlds, the warning that might have changed everything had already been set aside, and the current carried everyone forward into the dark. Just as these young men carried the weight of history on their shoulders into waters they could not yet see, you can honor their legacy and understand the courage and chaos of these Pacific campaigns by exploring authentic World War II memorabilia, books, and artifacts, or by watching the powerful film Midway on Prime Video, which brings similar island battles to life with gripping detail. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The ships kept moving. The letters kept traveling. And on a small coral island no one on those ships had yet seen, men who had never heard Tommy's name were already waiting in the darkness they had carved into the ridges, preparing to turn a single ignored warning into months of suffering that no briefing had prepared anyone to face. The current had chosen its direction. All that remained was for the men to discover what it would cost them to follow it. In the hold of a transport ship rolling gently on the Pacific swell, a group of men who had already survived the worst the war could offer sat together playing cards by the light of a single bulb, laughing louder than the game required, because laughter was one of the few things they still controlled. These were the men of the old breed. They had fought on Guadalcanal when the jungle itself seemed to fight back, and on Cape Gloucester where the mud swallowed boots and men alike. They carried the quiet pride of having endured what newer units had only heard about in stories. That pride was real, earned in blood and sleepless nights, but it had also begun to shape the way they looked at the next fight. Experience had taught them how to stay alive. It had not yet taught them that the enemy had learned from the same battles. One of them, a sergeant named Harlan, dealt the cards with hands that were steady even though the ship's motion kept shifting the crate they used as a table. He had a way of making every hand feel like the most important one of the night. Across from him sat a younger Marine, barely out of his teens, who kept glancing at Harlan the way a younger brother watches an older one who has already been through the fire. The kid's name was Eddie. He had joined the division after Guadalcanal and still carried the eager uncertainty of someone who had trained hard but had not yet been tested in the way that mattered most. Harlan let him win the next hand on purpose, just a small kindness passed between men who knew they might soon be asked to watch each other die. Above them, on the open deck where the night air was cooler, another Marine leaned against the rail and stared at the dark water. He had already written his letter home that evening, the third one this week. In it he had told his wife about the food on the ship and the card games and how the Pacific sun still felt warm even this late in the year. He had not written about the way his stomach tightened every time the ship changed course or about the quiet conversations he overheard between officers who spoke in lower voices than usual. Some things were better left between the men who would actually step onto the beach. The briefings had been clear enough. This next island was important, necessary, but not expected to be another Guadalcanal. The men had been told it would be rough for a few days, then routine. The word quick had been used more than once by commanders who walked among them with the easy confidence of men who had planned the operation from maps and reports. That confidence traveled down the chain of command the way a story changes slightly each time it is retold. By the time it reached the riflemen, it had become something close to certainty. They had done this before. They would do it again. The enemy they faced now was the same enemy they had already beaten on other islands, only weaker and more desperate. What the briefings could not capture was the private conversation happening inside each man who had already seen too much. Harlan finished the card game and stepped out onto the deck for air. He found the Marine at the rail and offered him a cigarette without asking. They stood in silence for a while, the only sound the low thrum of the engines and the slap of water against the hull. After a long minute the younger man spoke. He said he kept thinking about how easy everyone said this one would be. Harlan nodded but did not answer right away. Then he said, quietly, that the last time someone had promised easy, they had spent weeks fighting for every yard of mud. He did not say it with fear. He said it the way a man passes along a lesson he had paid for with other men's lives. That kind of quiet exchange happened in dozens of small corners across the ship that night. Men who had learned to read each other's silences better than any map. They did not speak openly about doubt. Doubt was dangerous when it spread. Instead, they spoke around it, about home, about what they would do when the war finally ended, about the ridiculous things they had seen in training. The laughter that floated up from the hold was part of the same armor. It kept the fear from finding a place to settle. Yet underneath the practiced confidence there was something new this time. On earlier islands the Japanese had met them on the beaches or in the jungle with the same fierce, direct attacks the Marines had come to expect. Those fights had been terrible, but they had followed a pattern the veterans understood. Now there were rumors, passed from intelligence officers to company commanders and then carefully down to the men, that the enemy on this next island was preparing differently. They were not planning to stop the landing at the water's edge. They were digging into the high ground, turning ridges and caves into positions that could not be bombed into silence. The veterans listened to these fragments and filed them away the way they filed away every small piece of information that might one day keep them alive. But the official word remained the same, necessary, important, and not expected to drag on. Eddie, the young Marine who had lost the card game on purpose, sat on his bunk later that night and tried to write his own letter. He had already torn up 2 versions. The first one had been too cheerful, the second too honest. He finally settled on something in between, telling his parents about the card games and the food and how the older guys looked out for the newer ones. He did not write that he had noticed how some of those older guys stared at the horizon a little longer than necessary or that their jokes sometimes ended too quickly. He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket to mail when he could. Then he lay back and listened to the ship breathing around him. Harlan stayed on deck a while longer after the cigarette was finished. He thought about the men under his charge, about how many of them still believed the next fight would follow the pattern of the last ones. He thought about the briefings and the maps and the way commanders spoke when they believed their own plans. Experience had taught him that plans rarely survived the first hour on the ground. What experience had not yet taught him was how completely a new kind of defense could change everything a veteran thought he knew about staying alive. Small kindnesses continued through the night. A Marine who could not sleep shared his last piece of chocolate with the man beside him. Another quietly took over a watch so a friend could finish a letter. These were not grand gestures. They were the ordinary ways men reminded each other that they were not alone in whatever was coming. The ship carried them forward through the dark water, and the men carried their mixture of hard-won confidence and private, unspoken questions. By morning the sea had changed color and the air felt heavier. The veterans moved through their routines with the same steady hands they had used the day before. They checked their weapons, adjusted their packs, and made the same small jokes. But every now and then one of them would pause and look toward the horizon as if trying to see something that had not yet appeared. The optimism that had been carefully built in the briefings was still there, wrapped around them like a familiar coat. It kept them moving. It also kept them from asking too many questions about what might be waiting in the ridges they could not yet see. The old breed had earned its name through survival. That survival had created bonds stronger than orders and quieter than speeches. Those bonds would carry them through whatever came next. What none of them could know yet was that the same experience that gave them their confidence was also preparing them to face something their previous battles had not prepared them to understand. The island ahead would test not only their courage but the limits of what hard-won lessons could protect them from when the enemy had learned to fight in an entirely new way. Just as these men carried both the strength of their experience and the hidden cost of their optimism into waters that still looked calm, you can uncover the raw, uncensored truth of what they were about to face through an exclusive digital collection of previously unseen photographs, personal letters, and restricted footage from Peleliu and other Pacific battles, material too visceral and revealing for mainstream platforms. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The ship kept its steady course. The men kept their steady routines. And somewhere ahead, the ridges that would soon become names no one had yet spoken were already waiting, carved and reinforced by hands that had studied every mistake the Americans had made on earlier islands. The old breed was ready to land. What they were not yet ready for was how completely this fight would refuse to follow the story they had been told. In the heavy heat of a tropical afternoon, a colonel stood on a ridge and watched his men turn living coral into something that would one day be called hell by the men who tried to take it from them. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had been given an island and an order that left little room for hope. He was not expected to hold the beaches or to drive the enemy back into the sea. He was expected to make the enemy pay for every yard of ground with blood, and to keep paying until there was almost nothing left of his own command. That kind of order changes the way a man looks at the land he has been told to defend. Nakagawa looked at the ridges that ran through the center of the island and saw not obstacles, but opportunities. The coral was hard, but it could be carved. The heat was brutal, but men could work through it if they understood why the work mattered. He gave the order to begin, and the work started before the sun had fully risen the next morning. The soldiers who took up picks and shovels were not all career warriors. Many were conscripts who had been pulled from villages and cities across Japan and its territories, young men who had grown up farming rice or working in small shops. They had been told they were fighting for the emperor and for the homeland that most of them had never seen from this far away. Now they were being asked to dig their own future into the side of a ridge that offered almost no shade and very little water. The work was slow at first. The coral resisted every blow. Sweat ran into their eyes and turned the dust on their skin into streaks of mud. Yet the men kept at it because the alternative was harder to face than the labor itself. One of them, a private named Sato, wrote letters home whenever he could find a quiet moment. He had already sent several, each one more careful than the last. In the most recent one he told his mother that the island was beautiful in its own way and that the work was hard but important. He did not write that he had begun to understand he would probably never see her again. That truth sat in his chest like a stone, but he kept it there because speaking it out loud would have made the days even longer. Instead he dug. When his arms grew too tired to lift the pick, he sat for a few minutes with his back against the coral wall he had just helped create and listened to the low voices of the men working nearby. Those voices carried the same mixture of resignation and quiet pride that had begun to settle over the entire command. The men talked about home in fragments, a favorite meal, a younger sister's wedding, the sound of rain on a tin roof. They did not talk much about what would happen when the Americans arrived. That conversation was unnecessary. Everyone understood that the plan was not to stop the landing but to survive it long enough to make the enemy regret having come. The caves they were carving would be connected by tunnels. Some would face the sea. Others would face inland. From hidden openings men could fire and then disappear back into the earth before the enemy could answer. It was not a plan built on hope of victory. It was a plan built on the certainty of cost. Nakagawa moved among the work parties without hurry. He spoke little, but when he did speak the men listened. He had a way of looking at a finished section of tunnel and seeing not just what had been done but what it would cost the enemy later. He praised good work quietly and corrected poor work without anger. The men respected him because he asked nothing of them that he was not willing to share. When water was short, he drank last. When the heat pressed down hardest in the middle of the day, he was still on the ridge, walking the lines, making small adjustments to the positions that would one day become killing zones. There were moments of unexpected kindness in those long days. A soldier who had finished his section early would quietly take the pick from a comrade whose hands were bleeding and finish the last few feet himself. Another would share the last of his rice ball without being asked. These were not grand gestures. They were the small ways men reminded each other that they were still human even while they were building something that would feel inhuman to anyone who tried to take it. In the evenings, when the work stopped and the light faded, small groups would gather near the entrances they had carved. They would smoke if they had cigarettes and talk in low voices about nothing important. The talk itself mattered more than the words. Sato finished another letter one evening and folded it carefully before tucking it away. He knew there might never be a chance to send it. The thought did not stop him from writing. The act of putting words on paper was a way of holding on to the person he had been before this island. In the letter he described the color of the sea at sunset and the way the ridges turned gold in the last light. He did not describe the way his back ached or the way the dust settled in his lungs. Those details belonged to the island now. The letter belonged to the life he was trying to keep alive inside himself. As the caves grew deeper and the tunnels began to connect, a different kind of understanding spread through the command. The men began to see the ridges not as a place they were defending but as a place they were becoming part of. The coral that had once seemed only hard and unforgiving now offered protection. The darkness inside the tunnels became familiar. Men who had once feared being buried alive found a strange comfort in the narrow passages they had carved with their own hands. They knew every turn. They knew which openings gave the best fields of fire. They knew which sections would collapse first if the enemy tried to blast them out. That knowledge was a form of power, even if it came wrapped in the certainty of their own ending. Nakagawa watched this transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and something closer to sorrow. He had been trained to fight battles that could be won. This one was different. The orders he had received left no path to victory that did not pass through the destruction of his own command. He accepted that. What he could not accept was wasting the lives under his care through poor preparation. Every tunnel that connected two positions, every hidden firing port, every carefully placed reserve of water and ammunition was a way of honoring the men who would one day have to use them. He did not speak of honor often. He showed it in the thoroughness of the work. The soldiers felt that same sense of purpose even when their bodies protested. One afternoon, a young corporal collapsed from the heat while carrying a load of coral rubble. Two of his comrades carried him to the shade of a newly finished cave entrance and gave him the last of their water. They did not scold him for slowing the work. They simply waited until he could stand again and then returned to their tasks without comment. The incident was not unusual. It happened often enough that no one remarked on it. What mattered was that the work continued and that no man was left to struggle alone when he reached his limit. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the heat eased slightly and the island felt almost peaceful, Nakagawa would sometimes stand alone on the ridge and look out toward the sea. He thought about the men who would come across that water. He did not hate them. He understood that they were following orders just as he was. What he felt was closer to a grim respect for the task both sides had been given. His job was to make their task as costly as possible. Their job would be to take the ground anyway. Somewhere in that terrible equation there was a strange kind of clarity. It removed the need for false hope and left only the work that still had to be done. Sato finished his final letter one night and did not try to find a way to send it. He folded it and placed it inside his tunic, close to his chest. Then he picked up his pick and returned to the tunnel he had been widening. The sound of tools striking coral echoed through the ridges like a slow, steady heartbeat. Men worked in shifts now, some sleeping in the caves they had already finished while others continued the labor. The island was changing. What had once been open ridges and scattered trees was becoming a network of hidden rooms and passages that only the men who built them fully understood. Nakagawa gave no grand speeches. He did not need to. The men already knew what was expected of them. They knew that when the ships appeared on the horizon they would not rush forward to meet them. They would wait in the darkness they had carved, listening to the bombardment, feeling the ground shake, and then they would do what they had been trained to do. They would make the enemy pay for every step. That knowledge did not bring comfort, but it brought a kind of steadiness. The fear that had been present at the beginning had not disappeared. It had simply been given a place to rest while the work continued. The colonel who had ordered this transformation walked the ridges one last time before the light changed. He stopped at each new position, spoke a few quiet words to the men there, and moved on. He did not promise them victory. He did not promise them survival. What he offered instead was the certainty that their labor had not been wasted, that every tunnel and every firing port would do exactly what it was meant to do when the time came. The men listened and returned to their tasks. In the fading light, the ridges looked almost ordinary again. Only the men who had lived inside them knew how completely the island had been turned into something else. Just as these soldiers poured their final strength and quiet courage into turning coral into a fortress that would test every limit of the men who came to take it, you can help keep these essential stories of courage and sacrifice alive with a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, to support the deep research, survivor accounts, and careful crafting that go into bringing forgotten history to light for new generations. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The work continued through the night. The sound of tools never fully stopped. And on both sides of the coming fight, men who had never met were already bound together by the same island, one side building the trap, the other side still believing they would walk through it quickly. The ridges waited in the darkness, patient and ready, while the men who had shaped them prepared to meet whatever crossed the water. In the gray light before dawn, the sea itself seemed to tremble as the first heavy shells began to fall on the distant ridges, and the men watching from the decks of the transports felt the low, rolling thunder in their chests long before the sound reached their ears. They had been told this was the softening. For days the big guns of the fleet had been speaking, and now, as the final hours before the landing slipped away, the bombardment reached its peak. From the ships it looked almost beautiful, flashes of light blooming along the horizon like distant fireworks, followed by the deep, chest-deep rumble that traveled across the water. Some of the younger Marines leaned on the rail and watched with a kind of grim satisfaction. The enemy was getting what was coming to him. The island was being pounded into submission. That was the story they had been given, and it was easy to believe while standing safely on a moving deck with the sea wind in their faces. But not everyone on those ships was watching with the same easy certainty. Scattered among the younger men were veterans who had seen this kind of preparation before. They stood a little apart, smoking quietly or simply staring at the horizon without speaking. One of them, a sergeant who had already survived 2 previous island campaigns, kept his eyes on the flashes and said almost nothing. When a young private beside him remarked that nothing could possibly be left alive after this much shelling, the sergeant took a long drag on his cigarette and answered without looking away from the distant fire. "They're not on the beaches," he said quietly. "They're waiting in the high ground. And high ground like that doesn't break easy." The private didn't answer. He just nodded once and went back to watching the horizon, but the easy confidence in his face had already begun to shift. Below decks the feeling was different again. In the crowded compartments where men tried to sleep or write letters or simply sit with their thoughts, the sound of the bombardment came through the steel hull as a constant, low vibration. It was almost soothing in its own way, proof that the Navy was doing its job. A young Marine named Lewis sat on his bunk with a small notebook open on his knee. He had been trying for an hour to finish a letter to his sister. Every time he started a sentence the ship would shudder and he would lose his place. Finally he wrote only a few lines. "They're hitting the island hard right now. It sounds like the end of the world out there. I keep thinking that when we go in it will already be over." He folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, and tucked it inside his shirt. Then he lay back and listened to the vibration traveling through the metal around him. On the deck above, the sergeant who had spoken earlier was still at the rail. Another veteran joined him, a corporal who had fought beside him on an earlier island. They didn't need to say much. They had developed the habit of reading each other's silences. After a while the corporal spoke. "They shortened the bombardment again," he said. The sergeant nodded. He had heard the same rumor from an officer who had come through their compartment earlier. The fleet was needed elsewhere. The schedule was tight. The island was supposed to be ready. Both men had seen what happened when schedules and assumptions met ground that refused to behave the way the maps said it should. They had learned to keep those thoughts to themselves, but the knowledge sat between them like a third person. The flashes on the horizon began to slow. The deep rolling thunder grew more spaced out. On the ships, men who had been watching started to straighten up and check their gear one more time. There was a feeling of movement now, of things beginning to happen. Orders were passed in low voices. Landing craft were prepared. The Marines who had been below decks came up in groups, squinting in the growing light. Many of them looked toward the island with a mixture of relief and curiosity. The bombardment had been heavy. Surely nothing could have survived that kind of pounding. The island looked quiet now. Smoke drifted above the ridges, but there were no answering flashes, no visible movement. It was easy, in that moment, to believe the job had already been done. Yet in small pockets across the transports, other conversations were happening. A lieutenant who had studied the aerial photographs gathered a few of his more experienced non-commissioned officers and spoke quietly. He pointed out that the ridges in the center of the island had looked low and rolling in the pictures, almost gentle. But the men who had flown over them at lower altitude had reported something different: sharp coral, deep shadows that might be cave entrances, ground that seemed to swallow artillery fire without showing much damage. The lieutenant did not say the word worry. He simply told his men to be ready for the high ground to fight back harder than the beaches. Then he moved on to check other sections of the ship. The non-commissioned officers stayed where they were for a moment longer. One of them lit a cigarette with hands that were steady, then passed it to the man beside him without speaking. The small act of sharing was enough. Lewis, the young Marine who had finished his letter, found himself standing near the sergeant who had spoken earlier. He had overheard the quiet exchange about the shortened bombardment and the high ground. He wanted to ask a question but wasn't sure how to begin. Finally he simply said, "Do you think they're still there?" The sergeant looked at him for a long moment. Then he answered, "Some of them. The ones who matter." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Lewis nodded and moved away, but the answer stayed with him as he checked his rifle one more time and adjusted the straps on his pack. As the light strengthened, the island began to take clearer shape on the horizon. It looked small from this distance, just a low, dark shape against the brighter sea. Smoke still rose from the interior in thin columns. The naval guns had fallen mostly silent now. Only an occasional shell still fell, as if to remind anyone listening that the Americans had not forgotten the island. On the transports, the final preparations were underway. Men moved with the practiced efficiency of units that had done this before. Yet underneath the efficiency there was a new tension that had not been present in earlier landings. The veterans felt it first. They had learned to listen to the silences between the briefings and the jokes. This silence felt heavier. A small group of Marines gathered near one of the landing craft stations. One of them pulled out a photograph of his wife and children and looked at it for a long moment before tucking it carefully back into his helmet. Another man offered him a piece of gum without being asked. These were the ordinary gestures that happened before every landing, but today they carried an extra weight. The men were not afraid in the way raw recruits might have been. They were something quieter and more complicated, experienced men who had already learned that the price of survival was often paid by the men standing next to them. They had come to accept that price. What they had not yet accepted was the possibility that this island might demand more than they had already given. On the bridge of one of the command ships, officers studied the latest reports from the spotting planes. The island was reported as heavily damaged. Many defensive positions appeared destroyed. The beaches looked clear. The language in the reports was careful and professional, but it carried the same underlying assumption that had shaped the entire operation: the enemy had been neutralized from the sea. What the reports could not show was what the coral ridges had hidden from the beginning. The caves the Japanese had been digging for months were deeper than any bomb or shell had reached. The men inside them had stayed in their positions during the bombardment, listening to the world shake above them, waiting for the noise to stop. They had not been broken. They had simply endured. The Marines on the transports could not know any of that yet. They only knew what they had been told and what their own instincts whispered. As the first landing craft began to swing out on their davits, the feeling on the ship shifted from waiting to movement. Men climbed down the nets into the bobbing boats with the same steady hands they had used on earlier mornings. The sea was calmer than it had been on some previous landings. That small mercy was noted and appreciated. Still, as each craft pulled away from the transport and turned toward the distant shore, the men inside it could feel the change in the air. The island that had looked quiet from a distance was growing larger. The smoke still rose from its ridges. And somewhere inside those ridges, men who had spent weeks turning coral into shelter were checking their weapons and listening for the sound of approaching engines. The thunder had done its work. It had cratered beaches and collapsed some surface positions. It had filled the air with dust and smoke. But it had not reached the men who had built their defense inside the earth itself. Those men were still waiting. And the Marines who were now crossing the last stretch of open water were about to discover how completely a bombardment can miss the thing that matters most. Just as these young men crossed the water carrying both the confidence of the reports they had been given and the quiet instincts of the veterans among them, you can join a passionate community of history lovers on Patreon for exclusive and censored podcasts, raw unedited video segments, and deeper explorations into the human side of World War II, where you can connect with others who believe in preserving the full, honest truth. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The landing craft kept moving. The island kept growing larger in front of them. And on both sides of the narrowing strip of water, men who had never seen each other were already bound together by the same piece of coral, one side still believing the thunder had done its job, the other side knowing exactly how much of the real fight still remained hidden in the ridges. The first boats touched the reef line. The men inside them stood and prepared to step into whatever the island had become after the thunder finally stopped. The first wave stepped off the landing craft into water that was already turning red, and the island that had been promised as a quick fight revealed its true face before their boots even touched the sand. The reef line stretched like a jagged wall between the open sea and the beach. The landing craft could not cross it, so the Marines had come in on amphibious tractors that crawled over the coral like strange, lumbering insects. Inside each one, men sat packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces set in the same expression of forced calm they had practiced for months. The steady clatter of the engines filled the space between them. Some stared straight ahead. Others kept their eyes on the small patch of sky visible through the open top. A few quietly checked their rifles one last time, even though they had already checked them a dozen times on the transport. When the first tractors reached the reef and began to climb over it, the sound changed. The engines strained. The vehicles rocked hard from side to side. Then the world exploded. It started with a single shell that landed just ahead of the lead tractor, sending a column of water and coral fragments into the air. Before the spray had even fallen, more shells were falling. Machine gun fire began to rake the line of approaching vehicles. The Japanese had not wasted their ammunition during the long bombardment. They had waited. Now, from hidden positions high in the ridges that rose behind the beach, they opened fire with everything they had. Inside the tractors the men could hear the impacts. Some of the vehicles took direct hits and shuddered violently. Others kept moving forward through the smoke and the spray. A young private named Miller gripped the side of his seat so hard his knuckles went white. He had never heard anything so loud in his life. The man next to him, a corporal who had already fought on another island, leaned close and shouted something Miller could not understand over the noise. Then the tractor lurched forward again and dropped down onto the other side of the reef into shallower water. When the ramp finally dropped, the men poured out into waist-deep water that was already stained pink in places. They had been told the beach would be the easy part. They had been told the bombardment would have cleared most of the resistance. What they found instead was a narrow strip of coral sand swept by fire from 3 directions. Men fell before they had taken 10 steps. Some dropped silently. Others cried out and went down into the water. The survivors kept moving because stopping meant dying where they stood. Miller made it to the sand and threw himself down behind a small rise of coral. The man who had been beside him in the tractor did not make it. Miller had seen him go down in the water but could not stop to help. Now he lay pressed against the coral, trying to make himself smaller while bullets snapped overhead and shells continued to burst along the shoreline. He could hear other men shouting, but the words were lost in the noise. He looked to his left and saw a sergeant crawling forward on his elbows, dragging a wounded man behind him. The sergeant's face was set in a grimace of effort and pain, but he did not stop. When he reached a slight dip in the ground, he pulled the wounded man in beside him and began tearing open a first aid packet with his teeth. Further down the beach, another group of Marines had managed to drag a machine gun into position. They were firing back toward the ridges, though they could not yet see exactly where the enemy fire was coming from. The gunner kept his head low and worked the weapon in short bursts. Every few seconds he would glance at the men around him as if checking that they were still there. One of them, a private who had only joined the unit a few weeks earlier, was staring at the water with wide eyes. The gunner reached over without looking and gave the young man's shoulder a hard squeeze. The gesture was small, almost rough, but it was enough to pull the private's attention back to the task in front of them. The beach offered almost no cover. What little protection existed came from scattered chunks of coral and the bodies of men who had already fallen. Marines learned quickly to use whatever was available. Some pulled the wounded behind them as they crawled. Others used their packs as shields while they moved forward a few feet at a time. The fire from the ridges never let up. It came in waves, machine guns from one direction, mortars from another, artillery from positions the bombardment had never reached. The men on the beach began to understand that they were not fighting an enemy on the sand. They were fighting an enemy who was still hidden in the high ground behind it. A lieutenant moved along the line, staying low, shouting orders that were half encouragement and half commands. He stopped beside a group of men who had managed to set up a small mortar. He pointed toward a section of the ridge where smoke was still rising from an earlier shell burst and told them to put fire there. The mortar crew went to work without hesitation. While they loaded and fired, the lieutenant kept moving. He paused only once, beside a wounded corporal who was trying to tie a bandage around his own leg with one hand. The lieutenant knelt, finished the bandage, and said something quiet that made the corporal nod. Then he was gone again, moving toward the next cluster of men who needed direction. Miller stayed where he was for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. He watched the water in front of him turn darker as more men fell trying to reach the sand. He saw one tractor take a direct hit on the reef and burst into flames. He saw men who had made it to the beach begin to push forward in small groups, using each other as cover. The noise never stopped. It became a single, constant roar that pressed against his ears and made thinking difficult. He focused on the small things instead, the feel of the coral under his hands, the weight of his rifle, the sound of his own breathing. When he finally began to move again, it was because a sergeant he did not know grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "We're not staying here," the sergeant said. His voice was calm in a way that did not match the chaos around them. Miller followed because there was nowhere else to go. They crawled together toward a slight rise where other men had already gathered. Along the way they passed a Marine who was sitting upright against a piece of coral with his eyes open. The sergeant checked him quickly, then shook his head once and kept moving. Miller did not look back. By mid-morning the first thin line of Marines had managed to establish a narrow foothold on the beach. It was not much, a few hundred yards of sand and coral that was still under constant fire, but it was something. Wounded men were being dragged back toward the water where corpsmen worked in the open because there was no cover to be found. The dead were left where they fell. There was no time and no way to move them. The living stepped over them or around them and kept going. Later in the day, the Japanese launched a counterattack with tanks that came down from the airfield area and tried to push the Marines back into the sea. The fight on the beach became even more confused. Marines with bazookas and anti-tank guns met the tanks at close range. The noise rose again as explosions rocked the narrow strip of ground. One tank was knocked out only a few dozen yards from where Miller and the sergeant had taken cover. The crew tried to escape and were cut down before they could get far. The remaining tanks withdrew back toward the ridges, but the damage had already been done. The thin American line had held, but it had cost more lives. As the sun began to drop, the firing slowed slightly. Not because the Japanese had been driven back, but because both sides were exhausted and running low on ammunition in some places. The Marines who were still on the beach began to dig in as best they could with whatever tools they had. Some used their helmets. Others used their hands. The holes they made were shallow, but they offered a little more protection than lying flat on the open sand. Miller sat in one of those shallow holes with his back against the coral wall and tried to drink from his canteen. The water tasted of metal and salt. He looked around at the men near him. Most of them were strangers. Some were already asleep from exhaustion. Others stared at nothing with the blank look of men who had seen too much in too short a time. A few were quietly checking their weapons or sharing the last of their rations. One Marine offered Miller a piece of chocolate without saying anything. Miller took it and ate it slowly. The sweetness tasted strange after everything else he had seen and smelled that day. The beach that had been promised as the easy part had become something else entirely. It had become a place where men learned in a single morning that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to keep moving even when fear was the only thing left. It had become a place where small acts of kindness, a hand pulling a wounded man to cover, a quiet word, a shared piece of chocolate, mattered more than any order. And it had become a place where the dream of a quick fight died in the surf and on the coral sand, replaced by the colder understanding that the real battle was still waiting in the ridges above them. Just as these men discovered in the first terrible hours that the island would demand far more than anyone had prepared them for, you can receive our free weekly newsletter packed with hidden histories and claim your complimentary copy of the ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, revealing the espionage, forgotten heroes, and behind-the-scenes decisions that changed the course of the war. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Night came slowly to the narrow strip of beach the Marines had bought with blood. The firing never completely stopped. From the ridges above them, Japanese mortars and machine guns continued to probe the American positions. The men in the shallow holes listened to the shells land and tried to rest when they could. Some wrote letters they knew might never be sent. Others simply lay with their rifles across their chests and waited for whatever the next day would bring. The beach had taken its toll. It had taken far more than anyone had expected. And it had only been the beginning. The men who reached the airfield first felt a surge of something close to victory as they stood on the flat, open ground that had been promised as the prize, only to watch that feeling drain away as the first wounded began stumbling back from the ridges beyond it. They had moved faster than anyone expected. The 5th Marines had pushed inland from the beaches with a determination that surprised even their own officers. The Japanese resistance on the flat ground had been lighter than feared. Mortar fire and scattered machine guns had taken a toll, but the main enemy strength seemed to have pulled back. By the time the lead elements reached the edge of the airfield, the Marines were already talking about it in low, hopeful voices. Some of them actually smiled as they crossed the open strip of coral and dirt. After the slaughter on the beaches, this felt like progress. They had taken the thing the planners had said mattered most. A young lieutenant named Reed stood near the center of the runway with a small group of his men. His face was streaked with sweat and dust, but there was a light in his eyes that had not been there that morning. He looked at the captured ground and then back toward the beach where smoke still rose in thin columns. "We're here," he said to no one in particular. One of his sergeants, a man named Cole who had already fought on 2 other islands, nodded but did not smile. Cole had learned to wait before believing good news. He kept his eyes on the low ridges that rose beyond the far end of the airfield. They did not look especially threatening from this distance, just a line of broken coral and scattered trees. Yet something about them made him keep watching. The first wounded man reached them a short time later. He was being helped by 2 Marines who had half-carried, half-dragged him across the open ground. His leg was wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage, and his face had gone pale beneath the dirt. When they lowered him to the ground near Reed's position, the wounded man tried to speak. His voice was hoarse from thirst and pain. He kept saying the same thing over and over. "They're not down here. They're up there. In the rocks." Reed knelt beside him and asked what had happened. The man's eyes were glassy. He described moving toward the ridges after the airfield was secured and walking straight into fire that seemed to come from nowhere. Men had fallen all around him. He had seen one of his friends shot through the chest while trying to reach a wounded buddy. The fire had not come from the flat ground. It had come from above and from the sides, from places the Marines could not see until it was too late. Cole listened without interrupting. When the wounded man finally stopped talking, Cole looked again at the ridges. They were closer now in his mind. What had seemed like a manageable line of hills a few minutes earlier now looked like something else entirely. He had seen this before on other islands, the enemy giving ground on purpose, drawing the Americans forward into ground of their choosing. He kept that thought to himself for the moment. The men around him were still riding the thin wave of relief that came from having reached the airfield. Some of them were already talking about how the worst might be over. But the wounded kept coming. Not in large numbers yet, but steadily. A corporal with a shattered arm. A private whose face had been cut by coral fragments when a shell burst nearby. Each one brought fragments of the same story. The ridges were not empty. The Japanese had not retreated in defeat. They had pulled back into positions that the bombardment had barely touched, and they were waiting. The Marines who had pushed too far too fast were paying for that mistake in blood. Reed tried to organize the men who were still on their feet. He sent small patrols toward the edge of the airfield to link up with other units and to get a better look at the ground ahead. The patrols did not go far. They came back reporting the same thing the wounded had said. The moment anyone moved off the flat ground and into the broken coral at the base of the ridges, accurate fire opened up from multiple directions. There were no obvious targets to shoot back at. The enemy was using the terrain itself as cover. One of the patrols brought back a sergeant who had been hit in the shoulder. While a corpsman worked on him, the sergeant spoke quietly to Cole. He described watching an entire squad get pinned in a shallow draw. The fire had come from above them and from positions on either side. When they tried to pull back, more fire came from behind them. It was as if the ground had been designed to trap anyone who entered it. The sergeant's voice was steady, but his eyes kept drifting toward the ridges as he spoke. Cole thanked him and moved away. He found Reed and told him what he had heard. Reed listened carefully. The light that had been in his eyes earlier was already beginning to fade. As the afternoon wore on, the sense of triumph that had briefly touched the airfield began to slip away. Men who had been joking a few hours earlier now sat in small groups, cleaning weapons or sharing water with quiet efficiency. The wounded who could still walk were being helped back toward the beach for evacuation. Those who could not were made as comfortable as possible where they lay. The open ground of the airfield, which had felt like a victory when they first crossed it, now felt exposed. There was no cover here. If the Japanese brought artillery or mortars down on this position, the Marines would have nowhere to hide. Miller, the young private who had survived the beach that morning, found himself on the airfield with what was left of his squad. He had not expected to feel anything like relief so soon after the horror of the landing. Yet when he stepped onto the flat ground, something inside him had loosened for a few minutes. Now that feeling was gone. He watched a wounded man being carried past on a stretcher and recognized him as someone from another platoon. The man's eyes were closed, but his lips were moving as if he were still trying to warn someone. Miller looked toward the ridges and felt the same tightening in his stomach that he had felt on the beach. Only this time it was worse, because he understood that the beach had only been the beginning. Cole moved among the men, checking positions and making sure everyone had ammunition and water. He stopped beside Miller and offered him a cigarette. They smoked in silence for a minute. Then Cole spoke. They pulled us in, he said. Gave us the easy ground so we'd keep coming. Miller nodded. He had already started to understand that on his own. The airfield was not the prize. It was the doorway. And the Japanese were waiting on the other side of that doorway with the real fight. As the light began to fade, the Marines on the airfield dug in as best they could. There was not much cover to be found, but they scraped shallow holes in the coral and arranged what little protection they could manage. From the ridges came occasional bursts of fire, just enough to remind them that the enemy was still there and still watching. The men answered with their own fire when they could see a target, but mostly they waited. The brief moment of triumph had passed. In its place was a colder, heavier understanding. They had taken the airfield. Now they would have to decide whether to push into the ridges or hold what they had and wait for reinforcements. Either choice carried its own cost. Reed sat with his back against a small rise of coral and stared at the darkening sky. He thought about the wounded man who had kept repeating that the enemy was up there. He thought about the patrols that had come back reporting fire from invisible positions. He thought about how quickly the feeling of victory had turned into something else. Around him, his men were doing what they always did when there was nothing left to do but wait. They checked their weapons. They shared what little food and water they had. They spoke in low voices about nothing important. These small acts of ordinary humanity had carried them through the beach that morning. They would have to carry them through whatever came next. The airfield stretched out around them, flat and open and suddenly meaningless. The real island was waiting in the broken ground beyond it. And the men who had come so far were only beginning to understand how much more it was going to ask of them. Just as these Marines discovered that capturing the airfield was only the first step into a far deeper fight, you can honor the legacy of the Pacific Theater by discovering authentic World War II memorabilia, books, and artifacts, or watching the epic film Midway on Prime Video, which captures the courage and chaos of these island campaigns in powerful visual detail. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Night settled over the captured airfield. The firing from the ridges continued in sporadic bursts. The Marines in their shallow positions listened to the sounds and tried to rest when they could. Some of them wrote letters they knew might be their last. Others simply lay with their rifles close and waited for the orders that would send them forward again. The airfield had been taken. The trap had already begun to close. And the men who had felt a moment of triumph were learning, one wounded man at a time, that the real battle had only just started. The men who entered the ridges under Chesty Puller's command did not simply disappear into the coral. They were slowly erased by it, 1 yard and 1 life at a time, until even the strongest among them began to move like ghosts through a landscape that refused to let them live or die cleanly. The first Marines had been ordered forward after the airfield was secured. What had felt like progress on the flat ground quickly turned into something else once they left the open runway and stepped into the broken, jagged world of the Umurbergal. The ridges did not rise gently. They rose in sharp, twisted spines of coral that cut through boots and skin like shattered glass. There was almost no vegetation to provide cover, only scattered scrub and the harsh white glare of the coral itself under the brutal sun. The heat pressed down like a living thing. Men who had already fought through the beach now faced a new kind of enemy, one that did not need to be seen to kill. Puller moved among his men with the same restless energy he had always carried. He was everywhere at once, or so it seemed to the exhausted Marines who looked up from their shallow positions and saw his familiar figure moving along the line. He did not shout orders in the dramatic way some imagined. He spoke in a low, direct voice that carried the weight of experience. When he told the squad to push toward a particular knob of coral, the men went, even when every instinct told them to stay low. They trusted him because he had survived other hells and because he never asked them to go where he would not go himself. But trust could not change the ground they were being asked to cross. A young corporal named Hayes led a small squad into a narrow draw between two ridges. The coral walls on either side rose steeply, and the only way forward was to climb. Hayes went first, testing each handhold carefully. Behind him came the rest of his men, moving slowly because every movement sent small showers of loose coral rattling down. They had not gone far when the first burst of fire came from somewhere above and to their left. It was not a long burst, just enough to make them flatten against the rock. Hayes looked back at his men. One of them, a private named Ruiz, had been hit in the arm. The wound was not immediately life-threatening, but the bleeding was steady. Ruiz tried to keep climbing with one hand until Hayes ordered him to stay where he was and press the wound. The rest of the squad continued upward because stopping meant they would all be pinned and picked off. They reached a small ledge and found a shallow cave mouth. For a moment there was silence. Then a grenade came tumbling out. Hayes kicked it back inside and threw himself flat. The explosion was muffled by the coral. When the smoke cleared, 2 Japanese soldiers lay dead just inside the entrance. Hayes and his men moved past them quickly, but not before one of the Marines paused to take a canteen from a dead enemy soldier and hand it to Ruiz, who was still bleeding below. It was a small act, done without words, but it was the kind of thing that kept men moving when everything else told them to stop. Further along the ridgeline, another squad was having a different kind of fight. They had been ordered to clear a series of interconnected positions that seemed to have no end. Every time they thought they had silenced one firing point, another opened from a different angle. The coral was full of holes and cracks that the Japanese had turned into firing ports. Men could be killed from behind or from above without ever seeing who was shooting at them. A sergeant named Doyle tried to keep his men moving by focusing on the next small objective. 10 more yards, he would say. Then, after they gained those 10 yards, 10 more. The counting became a way of making the impossible feel possible. But even Doyle could see what was happening to his squad. Faces that had been sharp and alert that morning were now hollow-eyed and slack with exhaustion. Men moved more slowly. Their reactions were delayed. They were becoming ghosts of the Marines who had landed only days earlier. Puller appeared near Doyle's position in the early afternoon. He listened to the sergeant's report without interrupting, then simply said, "Keep pushing. We have to take the high ground or they'll own us from up there." There was no anger in his voice, only the steady certainty of a man who had made this kind of decision before. Doyle nodded and turned back to his men. He did not repeat Puller's words exactly. Instead, he told them they were doing good work and that every yard they gained made it harder for the enemy to stay hidden. The men listened because they trusted Doyle the way they trusted Puller. Then they started climbing again. The heat grew worse as the day went on. Men who had been rationing their water began to feel the first dangerous signs of thirst. Some tried to wet their lips with what little remained in their canteens. Others simply kept moving because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. The coral dust got into everything: eyes, mouths, wounds. It turned sweat into a gritty paste on skin. Wounds that had seemed minor on the beach now festered quickly in the heat and dirt. A corpsman working behind the line ran out of bandages and began tearing up shirts and using whatever clean cloth he could find. He worked without complaint, moving from one casualty to the next with steady hands even as the firing continued around him. Hayes and what was left of his squad reached another ledge by late afternoon. They had lost 2 more men to fire from unseen positions. Ruiz was still with them, though his arm had swollen badly. They found a slight overhang that offered a few feet of shade and stopped there to rest and redistribute ammunition. Hayes looked at his men and realized how much they had changed in just a few hours. Their faces were blank with fatigue. Their movements were automatic. They were still fighting, but something essential had already begun to leave them. He thought about saying something encouraging, but the words felt hollow. Instead, he simply shared the last of his water with Ruiz and told the squad they would move again when the firing slowed. From his position further back, Puller watched the slow, grinding advance of his regiment. He knew what was happening. He had seen units bleed themselves white before. But the orders were clear, and he believed the high ground had to be taken. He moved forward again, speaking to small groups of men, offering the same steady presence that had carried other commands through other impossible fights. Some of the Marines straightened when they saw him. Others were too exhausted to react. Puller did not push them harder than they could go. He simply made it clear that he expected them to keep going, and they did. As the sun began to drop, the ridges took on a different character. The shadows grew longer and deeper. The same coral that had been blinding white in the midday glare now looked almost black in the low light. The Japanese used the changing light to their advantage, shifting between positions and firing from new angles. The Marines answered with what they had, but their fire was growing more sporadic as ammunition ran low in some sections. Men began to realize they might have to spend the night on the ridges they had only partially cleared. The thought of darkness in that broken ground was worse than the thought of another day of climbing. Hayes's squad found a shallow depression and prepared to hold it through the night. They took turns on watch while the others tried to rest. Ruiz finally allowed himself to close his eyes, though his breathing was shallow and uneven. Hayes sat with his back against the coral and listened to the occasional bursts of fire echoing through the ridges. He thought about the men he had already lost and the men who were still with him. He thought about how far they had come since the beach and how little ground they actually controlled. The ridges had swallowed them. They were still fighting, but they were no longer the same men who had stepped off the landing craft. Something vital had been taken from them by the coral and the heat and the invisible enemy who refused to be driven out. Puller remained on the line long after dark. He moved from position to position, speaking quietly with officers and non-commissioned officers, making sure the men knew they were not alone. In the darkness, the ridges felt even more hostile. Every sound carried. Every shadow seemed to move. The Marines who tried to sleep did so with their rifles across their chests and one ear open for the sound of movement. Some of them wrote short notes in the faint light of shielded flashlights, last messages in case they did not see another sunrise. Others simply lay still and waited for whatever the night would bring. The regiment that had entered the ridges that morning was still there when night fell, but it was no longer whole. Units had been reduced to shadows of their former strength. Men who had been strong and confident were now hollowed out by exhaustion and loss. They had become ghosts moving through a landscape that seemed designed to erase them. And still they held their positions, because stopping meant surrendering the ground they had already paid for with blood. The ridges had claimed their first heavy price, and the night was only beginning. Just as these Marines were slowly erased by the coral ridges that refused to yield, you can uncover the raw, uncensored truth of what they endured through an exclusive digital collection of previously unseen photographs, personal letters, and restricted footage from Peleliu and other Pacific battles, material too visceral and revealing for mainstream platforms. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The darkness settled deeper into the broken coral. The firing never completely stopped. And the men who had become ghosts in the ridges waited for morning, carrying the weight of everything they had already lost and everything they still had to face. The men in the ridges began to understand that the sea surrounding them was not an ally but a cruel joke, because the water they could see from every high point was salt, and the water they carried in their canteens was disappearing faster than any of them had imagined possible. The heat on Peleliu did not arrive gently. It pressed down from the moment the sun cleared the horizon and stayed until long after it had set. The humidity made every breath feel thick. Men who had already fought through the beach and into the broken coral now faced an enemy that needed no bullets. It needed only time and the sun. Their canteens, which had felt heavy when they landed, now felt dangerously light. Water discipline had been strict from the beginning, but strict discipline could not create water that did not exist. By the second day in the ridges, many men were already measuring their remaining supply in careful sips rather than full swallows. A private named Ellison sat with his back against a jagged piece of coral and stared at his canteen as if it contained answers. He had already poured a few precious drops onto a cloth to clean the worst of the grit from a cut on his forearm. The cut had begun to swell and turn an angry red at the edges. He knew he should not waste water on something so small, but he also knew what happened to wounds left untreated in this heat. Around him, the rest of his squad moved slowly. Every action seemed to cost more effort than it should. One man tried to clean his rifle and stopped halfway through because his hands were shaking. Another sat with his head between his knees, breathing in short, shallow gasps. No one spoke much. Talking used energy they could not afford to lose. Further along the line, a sergeant named Whitaker was dealing with a different problem. One of his men had collapsed while climbing a short slope. The heat had taken him suddenly. His skin was hot and dry, and he was no longer sweating. Whitaker had seen heat stroke before. He knew what it could do if it was not stopped. He dragged the man into the narrowest sliver of shade he could find and began pouring what little water remained in his own canteen over the man's head and chest. Another Marine knelt beside them and helped hold the unconscious man upright. They worked without speaking, because there was nothing useful to say. When the man finally stirred and opened his eyes, Whitaker gave him the last few drops from the canteen and told him to rest. Then he stood up and looked at the empty container in his hand for a long moment before tucking it away again. The island had water everywhere and none of it was useful. From certain ridges the Marines could see the ocean stretching out in every direction, blue and endless and completely undrinkable. Some men found themselves staring at it anyway, as if looking long enough might change what it was. Others tried not to look at all. The sight of so much water they could not touch made the thirst worse. A few men had tried collecting rainwater in their helmets during a brief shower the day before, but the rain had been light and the helmets had been filthy. What little they caught tasted of sweat, coral dust, and the metal of their gear. They drank it anyway. Ellison's squad received orders to move forward again in the early afternoon. The sun was at its worst. The coral reflected the heat upward so that it seemed to come from below as well as above. Every step required lifting their boots carefully because the sharp edges cut through the worn soles. Ellison felt his tongue growing thick in his mouth. He had been rationing his water so carefully that he had almost nothing left. When they stopped for a few minutes behind a slight rise, he allowed himself one small sip. The water was warm and tasted of the metal canteen, but it was still water. He passed the canteen to the man beside him without being asked. The man took an equally small sip and passed it back. No words were exchanged. The gesture was enough. Whitaker's platoon had a harder time that afternoon. They were trying to clear a series of small caves and firing positions that seemed to connect in ways no one could fully map. The work was slow and dangerous. Every time they moved, the heat and the thirst made their reactions slower. One of Whitaker's men was hit in the leg while trying to reach a wounded comrade. The wound itself was not immediately fatal, but the man could not walk. 2 others had to carry him. The extra effort in that heat was brutal. They stopped often to rest, and each time they stopped, Whitaker had to decide how much water to give the wounded man. He gave more than he should have. He told himself they would find more water soon. He told himself a lot of things to keep moving. As the afternoon wore on, the signs of severe dehydration became harder to ignore. Men's lips cracked and bled. Their eyes became sunken. Some began to see things that were not there, pools of water in the distance, friends who had already been killed walking beside them. Ellison saw his younger brother standing on a ledge above him for several seconds before he blinked and the image vanished. He did not tell anyone. He simply kept climbing. The hallucinations were frightening, but stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. The wounded suffered most. A cut that would have been minor in a cooler climate festered within hours in the heat and the dust. Infection moved through bodies that had no strength left to fight it. Corpsmen ran out of sulfa powder and cling bandages. They began using whatever they could find, strips of shirts, pieces of parachute silk, even the paper from ration boxes. One corpsman worked on 3 different men in the space of an hour, moving between them with steady hands even though his own canteen had been empty since morning. When he finally sat down for a moment, another Marine offered him a single swallow from his own nearly empty canteen. The corpsman accepted it without argument. Pride had no place when water was this scarce. Whitaker found himself carrying one of his wounded men for nearly an hour when no one else could take the weight. The man was heavier than he looked, and every step sent pain through Whitaker's shoulders and back. He kept his mind on small things, the next foothold, the next few yards of ground, the sound of the man's breathing to make sure he was still alive. When they finally reached a position where they could stop, Whitaker lowered the man carefully and then sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then the wounded man opened his eyes and whispered that he was sorry for being so heavy. Whitaker told him to save his strength and not to worry about it. Then he looked away so the man would not see how close he had come to breaking. By late afternoon, the entire ridgeline seemed to be moving in slow motion. Orders were still being given and men were still trying to obey them, but everything took longer. Reactions were delayed. Decisions that should have been automatic required conscious effort. Ellison's squad reached their objective, a small knob of coral that gave them a view of the ground ahead, and simply collapsed where they stood. No one had the energy to dig proper positions. They arranged themselves behind whatever cover they could find and waited for whatever came next. Ellison stared at his empty canteen and wondered how long a man could go without water before his body simply stopped working. He had heard stories. He did not want to find out if they were true. As the sun finally began to drop, the heat eased slightly, but the thirst did not. Night would bring its own problems, the cold that sometimes followed the brutal days, the constant fear of Japanese infiltration in the darkness, the knowledge that another day of this was coming. For now, the men focused on surviving the last hours of light. Whitaker moved among his men one more time, checking positions and making sure the wounded were as comfortable as possible. He had nothing left to give them except his presence. That seemed to be enough for some of them. They looked at him and saw that he was still standing, still moving, still trying. It gave them a reason to keep doing the same. Ellison sat with his back against the coral and listened to the low voices of the men around him. Someone was quietly singing an old song, more breath than sound. Another man was writing something in a small notebook with hands that shook slightly. Ellison closed his eyes for a moment and tried to remember what it felt like to not be thirsty. The memory would not come. All he could feel was the dryness in his throat and the weight of the empty canteen against his hip. The island had given them almost nothing they needed and everything they feared. The sea that surrounded them mocked their thirst. The sun that beat down on them stole their strength. The coral that cut their skin opened the door to infection that spread faster than any man could treat. And still they moved forward when they were told to move, and still they carried their wounded when they could barely carry themselves. The courage required to keep going in those conditions was not the loud, dramatic kind that stories usually celebrated. It was quieter. It was the decision to take one more step, to share one more sip, to stay beside a struggling man even when every instinct said to save yourself. That kind of courage did not make headlines. It simply kept men alive a little longer than they had any right to expect. Just as these Marines faced an enemy that could not be shot or bombed into silence, you can help keep these essential stories of courage and sacrifice alive with a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1. To support the deep research, survivor accounts, and careful crafting that go into bringing forgotten history to light for new generations. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Night finally came to the ridges. The temperature dropped, but the thirst remained. Men who had survived another day of heat and fire now faced another night of darkness and waiting. Some of them would not see the morning. Others would wake to find that their canteens were still empty and that the sun would rise again with the same merciless intensity. They had already given everything they had. The island was not finished asking. The ground itself began to breathe at night, and the men who had fought so hard to take the ridges learned that the real battle was no longer for the surface but for the darkness beneath it. By day the Marines continued their slow, grinding advance across the broken coral. They used flamethrowers and demolitions to seal cave entrances when they found them. They moved in small groups, watching every shadow and every crack in the rock. But when the sun dropped and the long shadows stretched across the ridges, everything changed. The Japanese who had stayed hidden during the daylight hours came out. They moved through the network of tunnels they had spent months carving, emerging from openings the Americans had not yet discovered. They did not come in large groups or with the desperate charges the Marines had seen on earlier islands. Instead, they moved in twos and threes, slipping between positions, firing a few quick shots, then disappearing back into the earth before anyone could fully react. A Marine named Keller was on watch one night when he heard the sound. It was not loud. Just a faint scraping, like boots moving carefully over loose coral. He had been sitting with his back against the low rise, trying to stay awake after another long day of climbing and fighting. His eyes were heavy, but the sound brought him fully alert. He did not call out immediately. He had learned that shouting in the dark often brought more fire than answers. Instead, he listened. The sound came again, closer this time. He eased his rifle up and waited. When the figure finally appeared, it was low to the ground and moving with deliberate care. Keller fired once. The figure dropped. For several long seconds there was silence. Then another shot came from somewhere to his left, and Keller pressed himself flat against the coral as bullets snapped overhead. When the firing stopped, another Marine crawled over to him. They checked the body together in the faint light of a shielded flashlight. It was a Japanese soldier, young, carrying only a rifle and a few grenades. There were no papers, no identification beyond what he wore. Keller looked at the face for a moment before they covered it. He had seen dead men before, but this one felt different. The man had not been trying to overrun their position. He had been trying to slip past it, to get behind them, to create fear in the darkness. That kind of fighting required a different kind of courage. It required accepting that you would probably not return. Inside the cave system, the Japanese soldiers lived in a different kind of world. The tunnels were narrow and low. Men moved through them bent almost double, carrying what little water and food remained. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cordite, and the bodies of men who had already died in the fighting. Some of the caves had been turned into aid stations where wounded soldiers lay on the coral floor with almost no medicine left to give them. Others were used as command posts where officers tried to coordinate the night movements with what little communication they still had. One of those officers was a lieutenant named Tanaka. He had been given responsibility for a section of the tunnel network that connected several ridges. His orders were clear. He was to harass the Americans at night, to keep them from resting, to make them pay for every yard they tried to hold. He did not question the orders. He had been trained to follow them. But in the quiet moments between missions, when he sat with his back against the damp coral wall and listened to the breathing of the men around him, he allowed himself to think about what those orders actually meant. Most of the men under his command would not leave these tunnels alive. They all knew it. Yet they continued to go out each night because the alternative was to wait underground until the Americans found them and burned or blasted them out. Tanaka had a small notebook in which he sometimes wrote short messages to his family. He knew there was almost no chance the messages would ever reach them. Still, the act of writing gave him something to hold on to. In one entry he described the sound of American flamethrowers echoing through the tunnels earlier that day. He wrote that the heat had been so intense even through the rock that some of the men had pressed their faces against the cooler parts of the wall. He did not write about fear. He wrote about the men who had gone out the night before and not returned. He wrote their names carefully, as if by recording them he could keep some part of them from being lost. On the surface, Keller and the other Marines tried to find ways to stay alert through the long nights. Sleep was almost impossible. Every sound could be the beginning of an attack. Men took turns on watch, but even when they were supposed to be resting, their bodies stayed tense. Small kindnesses became important. One Marine would share the last of his water with the man coming off watch. Another would take an extra turn on guard so a tired friend could try to sleep. These gestures did not change the situation, but they reminded the men that they were not completely alone in the darkness. The Japanese night movements created a constant sense of being watched. Marines would clear a position during the day only to find that the same ground had been reoccupied during the night. Grenades would be tossed into foxholes without warning. Snipers would fire from positions that had been silent all day. The effect on the men was cumulative. After several nights of this, even the strongest among them began to show signs of strain. Eyes became hollow. Hands shook when they tried to light a cigarette. Conversations grew shorter and more functional. The laughter that had sometimes appeared in quieter moments on earlier islands was almost completely gone. Keller experienced this shift in himself. One night he found himself staring at a dark opening in the coral for nearly an hour, convinced that something was moving inside it. When he finally worked up the courage to investigate, the opening was empty. He told no one about the incident. He simply returned to his position and continued watching. The next morning he helped carry a wounded man back toward a collection point. The man had been hit during one of the night probes. As they moved, the wounded Marine kept asking if they were being followed. Keller told him they were not, even though he was not entirely sure it was true. Inside the tunnels, Tanaka prepared another group of men to go out. He spoke to them quietly, giving instructions on which routes to use and what to do if they encountered resistance. The men listened without asking questions. When it was time, they moved out through one of the hidden exits, disappearing into the darkness above. Tanaka remained behind. He sat in the narrow tunnel and listened to the distant sounds of firing that soon began. He thought about the men he had just sent out and the men who had gone out the night before. He thought about the Americans on the surface who were trying to sleep. He understood that both sides were trapped in the same terrible equation. The Americans could not rest. His own men could not leave. The island had become a place where neither side could truly win, only continue. As the nights passed, the psychological pressure grew on both sides. The Marines developed new habits out of necessity. They learned to sleep in short stretches, to keep their weapons always within reach, to move in pairs even when going to relieve themselves. Some of them began to talk about the caves as if they were alive. They spoke of the way the enemy seemed to appear and disappear at will. The fear was real, but it was mixed with a growing respect for the men who fought from inside the earth. These were not the reckless charges they had expected. This was something colder and more deliberate. Tanaka received word that one of the groups he had sent out the previous night had not returned. He added their names to the list in his notebook. Then he prepared the next group. The routine had become its own kind of survival. As long as there were orders to give and men to send, the fight continued. Outside, Keller and the other Marines continued to hold their positions through another night of probes and sudden violence. When morning finally came, they emerged from their shallow holes looking older than they had the day before. The caves had not been sealed. The enemy had not been driven out. The night had simply ended, and another day of climbing and burning and dying had begun. The men on both sides had entered this fight with different ideas about what courage looked like. The Americans had expected to meet their enemy in the open. The Japanese had expected to die in place. What neither side had fully understood was how completely the caves would change the nature of the battle. The darkness became a weapon. The tunnels became a refuge and a prison at the same time. And the men who fought in and around them were forced to find new ways to endure what no training had prepared them to face. Just as these soldiers on both sides were drawn into a hidden war beneath the surface that tested every limit of human endurance and fear, you can join a passionate community of history lovers on Patreon for exclusive and censored podcasts, raw unedited video segments, and deeper explorations into the human side of World War II, where you can connect with others who believe in preserving the full, honest truth. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The sun rose again over the ridges. The Marines began another day of trying to clear what could not be fully cleared. And deep inside the coral, the men who remained in the tunnels prepared for another night of moving through the darkness, carrying with them the names of those who had already been lost and the quiet certainty that their own names would one day be added to the same list. The men of the 1st Marines kept climbing even as their numbers shrank, because the orders had not changed and because the alternative to forward movement was to stay where they were and die anyway. By the time the regiment had been in the ridges for several days, the cost was already visible in every face. Companies that had landed with full strength were now reduced to shadows of what they had been. Men moved more slowly. Their eyes were sunken from lack of sleep and water. Their uniforms were stiff with dried sweat and coral dust. The aggressive push that had been ordered from above continued, but the men executing it were no longer the same force that had stepped off the landing craft. They were being asked to do what they had always done, advance and take ground, but the ground they were taking was exacting a price that no one on the beach or in the planning rooms had fully calculated. A sergeant named Harlan moved through what remained of his platoon with the steady presence that had kept men alive on earlier islands. He no longer counted his men out loud. He had learned that counting only made the absences more obvious. Instead, he spoke to them individually when he could, checking that they had ammunition, that their wounds were bandaged as well as possible, that they had not reached the point where they simply could not go on. Most of them still answered when he spoke. Some answered with the same dark humor that had carried them through other fights. Others answered with only a nod, their eyes already distant. Harlan understood both responses. He had seen men reach the end of what they could endure before. He had never seen an entire regiment reach it at the same time. One of the men still with him was a private named Lewis. Lewis had been hit in the side during a night probe 2 days earlier. The wound was not deep, but it had begun to fester in the heat. He walked with one hand pressed against his ribs and tried not to let the pain show in his face. When Harlan stopped beside him, Lewis straightened as much as he could and said he was ready to move. Harlan looked at him for a long moment, then simply nodded and moved on. He did not order Lewis to stay behind. He knew the younger man would have refused anyway, and he also knew that every rifle still able to fire mattered more than it ever had before. Further along the line, a lieutenant named Reed was trying to make sense of the orders that kept coming down. The regiment was to continue pressing toward the high ground. There was no mention of relief or reinforcement in the immediate future. Reed had already lost half his platoon. The men who remained looked at him with a mixture of trust and something closer to resignation. He had led them through the beach and into the ridges, and they still followed him. But Reed could see what was happening to them. He could see the way they moved, the way they no longer joked between bursts of fire, the way some of them stared at nothing for long moments before remembering where they were. He carried the weight of those changes every time he gave the order to move forward again. The aggressive leadership that had defined the regiment from the beginning was still in place. Chesty Puller continued to appear along the line, speaking in that same low, direct voice, making it clear that the push had to continue. He did not ignore the cost. He saw the empty spaces where men had been. But he also believed that stopping would only give the enemy more time to strengthen positions that were already difficult enough to take. The momentum had to be maintained. That belief traveled down through the officers and non-commissioned officers until it reached men like Harlan and Reed, who then had to turn it into action with whatever strength remained in their units. There were moments when the cost became impossible to ignore. A squad that had been ordered to clear a small cave system returned with only 3 men. The others had been caught in a crossfire from positions that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The survivors sat in silence for a long time after they reached the rest of the platoon. One of them eventually spoke, describing how the man next to him had been hit and how there had been no way to reach him without exposing everyone else. Harlan listened without interrupting. When the man finished, Harlan simply placed a hand on his shoulder for a moment before moving on to check the next position. There was nothing useful to say. The only thing left was to keep going. Lewis found himself thinking about home more often as the days passed. He had stopped writing letters because there was no way to send them and because putting words on paper made the distance feel even greater. Instead, he carried a small photograph of his family inside his helmet. Sometimes, when the firing slowed, he would take it out and look at it for a few seconds before putting it away again. The faces in the photograph had begun to feel like they belonged to another life. The man who had left that photograph behind was not the same man who now moved through the ridges with a festering wound and an empty canteen. Reed received orders late one afternoon to push toward a particular knob of coral that dominated the ground ahead. He looked at the map, then at what remained of his platoon, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The knob was exactly the kind of position the Japanese had prepared for. It would cost men to take it. He gave the order anyway because that was what he had been trained to do and because stopping would have required admitting that the regiment could no longer accomplish what was being asked of it. The men moved out without complaint. Some of them looked back once before they started climbing. Reed did not look back. He kept his eyes on the ground in front of him and tried not to count how many of his men were no longer there to follow. The fighting for that knob lasted into the evening. By the time it was over, Reed's platoon had been reduced again. The position was taken, but the cost had been high. Harlan's squad had been part of the final push. When they reached the top, Harlan looked around at the men still standing and realized that he now led what had once been a full platoon with only a handful of survivors. He did not say anything about it. He simply began organizing defensive positions for the night. Lewis was still with him, though the wound in his side had gotten worse. Harlan made sure the younger man had the best cover available and told him to rest when he could. Lewis nodded and tried to smile, but the expression did not reach his eyes. As darkness settled over the ridges, the men who remained tried to find what little rest was possible. Some wrote short notes in the faint light of shielded flashlights. Others simply sat with their rifles across their laps and stared into the dark. The momentum that had carried the regiment forward for days had not stopped, but the men executing it had been worn down to something close to breaking. They had given everything that could be asked of them and more. The orders continued to come. The ground continued to demand payment. And the regiment that had once been one of the most experienced and aggressive in the Marine Corps was slowly being sacrificed, one exhausted man and one impossible order at a time. Puller moved along the line again after dark, speaking with the officers and non-commissioned officers who were still on their feet. He did not offer false hope. He simply made it clear that the fight was not over and that every position still held mattered. The men listened because they respected him and because they had no choice but to continue. When he left their positions, they returned to the work of staying alive through another night in the ridges. The cost was no longer something that could be measured in numbers alone. It was measured in the hollow eyes of the survivors, in the empty spaces where friends had been, and in the quiet understanding that the momentum they had been ordered to maintain was being paid for with the regiment itself. Just as these men were pushed beyond every limit by decisions made far from the ridges. You can receive our free weekly newsletter packed with hidden histories and claim your complimentary copy of the ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, revealing the espionage, forgotten heroes, and behind-the-scenes decisions that changed the course of the war. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The night passed with the same sporadic firing that had become familiar. When morning came, the men who could still stand prepared to move again. The regiment was no longer whole. It was no longer the force it had been when it landed. But it was still there, still climbing, still obeying the orders that continued to come down from above. The altar of momentum had claimed its price. The men who remained were simply trying to survive long enough to see what would be asked of them next. The darkness on the ridges did not simply hide the enemy. It became the enemy, moving with purpose and carrying knives into the places where men tried to rest. Night after night, the Japanese used the cover of darkness to turn the Marines' own lines against them. They did not come in waves or with the reckless charges that had defined earlier battles. Instead, they moved in small groups, sometimes alone, slipping through gaps in the coral, crawling along draws and ledges that the Americans had not yet fully secured. They carried grenades and knives and the knowledge that fear in the dark could accomplish what daylight attacks had not. The Marines who had already endured the beach, the ridges, the heat, and the thirst now faced an enemy that attacked when their bodies most needed rest and their minds were least prepared to fight. A Marine named Keller had been on watch for what felt like hours when he heard the sound. It was faint, a soft scraping against coral somewhere to his left. He had learned not to trust every sound, but he had also learned that ignoring the wrong one could be fatal. He eased his rifle up and waited, his eyes straining against the darkness. The night was never completely black on Peleliu. There was always some faint light from the stars or the distant glow of fires, but it was enough to create shadows that moved when the wind shifted or when exhaustion played tricks on tired eyes. Keller listened. The scraping came again, closer. He did not call out. He had seen what happened when men shouted in the dark. Instead, he waited until the shape was close enough that he could be certain, then fired once. The shape dropped. For several long seconds there was silence. Then a grenade landed a few yards away and exploded, sending fragments singing through the air. When the smoke cleared, another Marine crawled over to check on him. They found the body of a Japanese soldier who had been trying to slip past their position. He carried a knife and 2 grenades. There were no papers. Keller looked at the face for a moment before they dragged the body away. The man had not been trying to overrun them. He had been trying to get behind them, to create chaos in the darkness, to make every man on the line wonder if the next shadow was death coming on quiet feet. That kind of fighting did not require numbers. It only required the night and the willingness to move through it alone. Further along the ridge, a sergeant named Harlan was trying to keep his remaining men alert through another long watch. The squad had been reduced to a handful of survivors. Sleep was almost impossible. Every man took turns on guard, but even when they were supposed to rest, their bodies stayed tense. Harlan moved among them quietly, speaking in low voices, making sure no one was alone for too long. He had seen what isolation in the dark could do to a man. One of the younger Marines, Lewis, was sitting with his back against the coral, his rifle across his lap. His eyes were open, but Harlan could tell he was fighting to stay awake. Harlan sat beside him for a few minutes without speaking. Then he offered Lewis the last of his water. Lewis took a small sip and passed the canteen back. The gesture was small, but it was enough to remind both men that they were not completely alone in the darkness. The infiltrations created a constant state of jumpiness that wore men down faster than the fighting itself. A branch moving in the wind could make a man fire. A comrade returning from relieving himself could be mistaken for an enemy in the split second before recognition. Men learned to speak softly when approaching their own lines at night. They learned to answer challenges with specific phrases that changed daily. Still, mistakes happened. One night a Marine returning from a listening post was challenged and did not answer quickly enough. The man on watch fired before he could stop himself. The returning Marine survived, but the incident left both men shaken. They did not speak of it afterward, but the tension between them remained for days. Inside the Japanese positions, the men who went out at night moved with a different kind of fatalism. They knew the chances of returning were low. They had been ordered to create fear, to disrupt American rest, to make the ridges as costly as possible. Some of them carried knives because ammunition was running low. Others carried grenades because a single well-placed explosion in a foxhole could do more damage than a rifle in the dark. They moved carefully, using the same terrain features the Marines were trying to secure. When they encountered resistance, they did not linger. They struck and withdrew, disappearing back into the tunnels or into the broken coral before the Americans could organize a response. One of those men was a soldier who had been given the task of slipping past a particular Marine position and dropping grenades into the foxholes behind it. He moved slowly, stopping often to listen. The night was full of small sounds, the wind moving through scrub, loose coral shifting under boots, distant firing from other parts of the ridge. He reached the edge of the American line and waited. When he was certain no one had seen him, he began to move again. A Marine on watch heard the sound and challenged him. The Japanese soldier did not answer. He threw one grenade and began to crawl away. The explosion woke the men in the nearby foxholes. Someone fired in the direction of the blast. The soldier kept moving, low to the ground, until he reached a narrow draw that led back toward the Japanese lines. He did not know if he had caused any casualties. He only knew that he had done what he had been ordered to do. For the Marines, the nights became a test of endurance that went beyond physical exhaustion. The constant vigilance stole sleep. The sudden violence stole any sense of safety. Men who had already survived the beach and the daytime fighting in the ridges now faced the additional burden of knowing that death could come from any direction at any time, even when they were trying to rest. Some of them began to develop small rituals to stay sane. One Marine always touched the stock of his rifle 3 times before settling into his position. Another whispered the same phrase every time he took over a watch. These small acts did not change the reality around them, but they gave the mind something familiar to hold onto when everything else was uncertain. Harlan watched his men change as the nights passed. The dark humor that had once appeared between bursts of fire grew quieter. Conversations became shorter and more practical. Men who had once shared stories about home now spoke mostly about the immediate tasks in front of them. Yet the bonds between them grew stronger in other ways. When one man was struggling to stay awake, another would quietly take part of his watch. When a grenade landed too close, men reached for each other without thinking, pulling wounded comrades to better cover. These were not grand gestures. They were the ordinary ways men reminded each other that they were still part of something larger than their individual fear. Keller found himself thinking about the Japanese soldier he had killed on watch. He had not seen the man's face clearly in the darkness, but he had felt the weight of what had happened. The infiltrator had not been trying to win the battle. He had been trying to make the night unbearable. Keller understood that now in a way he had not before. The Japanese were not simply defending ground. They were using the darkness itself as a weapon, turning the Marines' need for rest into another battlefield. That understanding did not make the nights easier. It only made the fear more specific. As another night settled over the ridges, the men prepared for whatever would come. They checked their positions one more time. They spoke in low voices about nothing important. They tried to rest when they could, knowing that sleep would be broken and shallow. Somewhere in the darkness, Japanese soldiers were already moving through the same broken coral, carrying the same quiet determination to make the night costly. The battle had become something neither side had fully expected. It was no longer only about taking or holding ground. It was about who could endure the darkness longer, who could keep moving when every sound carried the possibility of sudden violence, and who could still find the strength to reach for the man beside him when the knives came out of the night. Just as these men discovered that the true test of courage often came not in the light of day but in the long, uncertain hours when darkness itself carried knives, you can honor the legacy of the Pacific Theater by discovering authentic World War II memorabilia, books, and artifacts, or watching the epic film Midway on Prime Video, which captures the courage and chaos of these island campaigns in powerful visual detail. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The night passed with the same pattern of sudden violence and long stretches of tense silence. When morning finally came, the men who had survived emerged from their positions looking older than they had the day before. The ridges had taken more from them during the darkness than they had during the daylight fighting. And still the orders would come to move forward again, because the momentum that had carried the regiment into this place had not yet been broken, even if the men executing it were being worn down one sleepless night at a time. The ridges known as the Five Sisters did not simply rise from the coral. They waited, patient and merciless, demanding that every man who tried to cross them pay in blood before they would yield even a single yard. The Marines who approached them had already learned that this island did not give ground easily. What had begun as a push across open terrain had become a slow, grinding crawl through broken coral and jagged ridges that offered almost no cover and every possible advantage to the defenders. The Five Sisters were not dramatic peaks. They were a series of steep, interconnected coral formations that rose like broken teeth from the center of the island. Between them ran narrow draws and sheer faces that forced men into the open if they wanted to advance. The Japanese had turned every ledge and crevice into a firing position. From above and from the sides, they could pour fire down on anyone who tried to climb. A squad led by a corporal named Hayes was ordered forward one morning with the simple instruction to take the nearest of the sisters. Hayes looked at the ground ahead and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had become constant since they entered the ridges. The slope was steep and exposed. There was almost no vegetation, only sharp coral that cut through boots and hands. His men were already exhausted from days of fighting with little rest and less water. Still, they moved when he gave the order. They moved because stopping was not an option and because the alternative was to remain pinned where they were while the enemy above continued to harass them. They started up the slope in small groups, using what little cover existed. Almost immediately, fire opened from positions above them. It was not a single burst but a coordinated response from multiple angles. Bullets snapped against the coral. Men pressed themselves flat against the rock, trying to make themselves as small as possible. Hayes shouted for them to keep moving, but movement only made them better targets. One of his men, a private named Ruiz, was hit in the leg and went down hard. Another Marine immediately crawled to him and began pulling him back toward a slight depression in the slope. The fire continued, steady and accurate. Hayes reached a small ledge and pulled himself up. From there he could see more of the ridge system. The other sisters rose beyond the first, connected by narrow spines of coral that offered no protection. He could see the muzzle flashes from Japanese positions, but he could not see the men firing. They were hidden in caves and behind natural barriers that the bombardment had never reached. He looked back down the slope at his men. Some were still climbing. Others had found what shelter they could and were returning fire. The man who had gone to help Ruiz was now dragging him toward better cover while another Marine provided what little suppression he could. The fighting seesawed throughout the morning. Small groups of Marines would gain a few yards, only to be driven back by fire from positions they could not locate. When they tried to rush forward in larger numbers, the enemy responded with mortars and grenades that rolled down the slopes. The Marines learned quickly that massed movement only drew heavier fire. Progress came in inches, not yards. One man would crawl forward while others covered him. Then another would follow. It was slow, exhausting work that left men gasping and bleeding from dozens of small cuts caused by the coral. Ruiz lay in the shallow depression where they had dragged him. The wound in his leg was bleeding steadily. The Marine who had stayed with him, a quiet man named Ellison, tore strips from his own shirt to make a bandage. He worked with steady hands even as bullets continued to snap overhead. When Ruiz tried to apologize for slowing them down, Ellison simply shook his head and told him to save his strength. There was no anger in his voice, only the tired practicality of men who had already seen too much. He finished the bandage as best he could and then picked up his rifle again, firing toward the positions above whenever he saw movement. Hayes tried to coordinate with other units on either side, but the terrain made communication difficult. The ridges broke up lines of sight and sound. Every small group was fighting its own private battle against the same enemy. Hayes could hear firing from the next draw-over, but he could not see what was happening. He focused on what was in front of him. His squad had managed to reach a slightly better position on the ledge, but they were still exposed to fire from at least two directions. He knew they could not stay there long. Either they pushed higher or they would be picked off one by one. The push higher came at a cost. One of the men was hit in the chest while trying to reach the next small rise. Another took a fragment from a grenade that rolled down from above. Hayes and the remaining men dragged both casualties back to the ledge. There was no way to evaluate them immediately. The only choice was to keep them as comfortable as possible and continue the fight. Ellison stayed with the wounded while Hayes led the others forward again. The slope seemed steeper with every attempt. The coral cut their hands and knees. Their boots slipped on the loose rock. Every time they gained a few feet, fire from hidden positions forced them down again. By midday the sun was brutal. The men who were still able to fight were running low on water and ammunition. Hayes looked at what remained of his squad and felt the weight of every decision he had made that morning. He had lost men. He had gained almost nothing that could be measured on a map. Yet the order to take the ridge still stood. He gave the word to try once more. This time they moved differently. Instead of rushing, they crawled from one small piece of cover to the next, using the dead coral itself as protection. It was slow and humiliating work, but it kept more of them alive. One of the men, a private who had only recently joined the squad, showed unexpected courage when a grenade landed near Hayes. Without hesitation, the young Marine kicked the grenade down the slope before it could explode. The blast still caught him in the legs, but Hayes was able to pull him to cover. The act was not dramatic or shouted about. It was simply done. Later, when the firing slowed for a few minutes, Hayes sat beside the wounded man and shared the last of his water with him. The young Marine tried to refuse, saying Hayes needed it more. Hayes told him to drink and not argue. The small exchange mattered more than either of them could say at the time. The fighting continued into the afternoon with the same grinding rhythm. Small gains followed by losses. Moments of individual courage followed by the quiet realization that the ridge was still not theirs. The Japanese defenders did not need to hold every position. They only needed to make every attempt to take those positions as costly as possible. From their hidden vantage points they could see the Marines clearly while remaining almost invisible themselves. The terrain did what no amount of pre-invasion bombing could undo. It turned the advantages of firepower and numbers into liabilities. As the light began to fade, Hayes and the few men still able to fight pulled back to the best position they could hold for the night. They had not taken the sister. They had not even reached the spine that connected it to the next ridge. What they had done was survive another day of fighting that offered no clear victory and no easy retreat. The wounded were made as comfortable as possible. The dead were left where they had fallen because there was no way to move them without exposing more men. Hayes sat with his back against the coral and looked at the ridge above them. It was still there, still waiting, still demanding payment for every step anyone tried to take. The men around him were quiet. Some cleaned their weapons with hands that shook from exhaustion. Others stared at nothing, their eyes distant. Ellison finished tending to the wounded as best he could and then sat down beside Hayes. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing useful to say about the day they had just lived through. The ridge had taken what it wanted. The men who remained had given what they could. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, the Japanese defenders were already preparing for whatever the night and the next day would bring. Just as these small groups of Marines discovered that some ground can only be taken one painful inch at a time, you can uncover the raw, uncensored truth of what they endured through an exclusive digital collection of previously unseen photographs, personal letters, and restricted footage from Peleliu and other Pacific battles. Material too visceral and revealing for mainstream platforms. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Night settled over the Five Sisters. The firing never completely stopped. From their positions on the lower slopes, the Marines listened to the sounds of the ridge above them and tried to rest when they could. They had not conquered the Stone Sisters that day. They had only survived them. And they knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that the ridges would still be waiting when the sun rose again. The mercy that finally reached the first Marines did not come in the form they had once imagined. It arrived wearing army green, and it carried with it a complicated mixture of relief and something that felt uncomfortably close to shame. The men who had fought their way into the ridges were no longer the same force that had landed weeks earlier. Companies that had once been full of strong, experienced Marines were now reduced to handfuls of exhausted survivors. Faces were hollow. Eyes were sunken from days without proper sleep. Bodies were marked by wounds that had not healed and by the relentless heat that had stolen strength faster than any man could replace it. They had been ordered to keep pushing, and they had obeyed. But obedience had a cost that was now visible in every movement and every silence. When word finally reached the forward positions that the Army's 81st Infantry Division was coming to relieve them, the reaction was not simple joy. A sergeant named Harlan received the news while sitting with his back against a piece of coral, trying to stay awake long enough to make sure his remaining men were still breathing. He listened to the runner without changing expression. When the young Marine finished speaking, Harlan simply nodded and said nothing for several long seconds. Then he stood up and began moving among his men, telling them quietly that help was on the way. Some of them looked up with the blank stare of men who had stopped expecting anything good to happen. Others nodded in the same tired way Harlan had, as if the news was too large to fully understand in that moment. One of the men still with Harlan was a private named Lewis. His wound had worsened over the days, and he had grown weaker with every climb and every night of listening for movement in the dark. When Harlan told him the army was coming, Lewis tried to smile, but the expression did not last. He looked past Harlan toward the ridges they had been fighting for and then back down toward the beach where the landing craft waited. "We're leaving them here," he said quietly. He did not need to explain who them were. Harlan understood. The dead and the badly wounded who could not be moved easily would remain on the island for now. The living were being taken out. Lewis closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again and asked if there was anything they needed to do before the army arrived. Harlan told him to rest. There would be time enough for the rest later. The process of relief was slower and more difficult than anyone had expected. The 81st Division soldiers who came forward to take over the positions moved carefully through ground that was still contested. They were fresh compared to the Marines, but they were not untouched by the island. Some of them had already seen fighting on nearby Ongaur. Still, they looked at the hollow-eyed men they were replacing with a mixture of respect and quiet shock. The Marines they were relieving had the look of men who had been fighting for much longer than the calendar suggested. Harlan stayed on the line while the handoff happened. He showed the incoming soldiers the best routes through the broken coral, pointed out the most dangerous firing positions they had identified, and warned them about the way the Japanese would probe at night. He spoke in the same steady voice he had always used, but there was a distance in it now. He was giving away ground he and his men had paid for with blood, and he could not pretend that handing it over felt like victory. When one of the army lieutenants asked him how long they had been up there, Harlan simply said, "Long enough." He did not elaborate. The lieutenant did not ask again. Lewis was helped down the slope by 2 Marines from another unit who had come up to assist with the evacuation of the wounded. He tried to walk on his own at first, but his leg would not hold him. One of the men supporting him kept up a quiet stream of conversation, talking about nothing important, the food on the ships, the weather, anything to keep Lewis from thinking too much about what he was leaving behind. Lewis answered when he could. Mostly he listened. When they reached a point where stretchers were waiting, he was placed on one carefully. Before they carried him away, he looked back up the ridge one last time. He could not see the men who were still fighting. He could only see the broken coral and the smoke that still rose from positions that had not yet been cleared. He turned his head forward again and did not look back. Higher up the line, officers were dealing with their own version of the same complicated relief. A lieutenant named Reed had been ordered to pull what remained of his platoon back to a collection point. He moved among his men, making sure everyone who could walk was accounted for and that those who could not were being prepared for evacuation. When he reached the last position his unit had held, he found 2 of his men still there, unwilling to leave until they were certain everyone else was out. Reed did not order them to go. He simply sat with them for a few minutes and shared the last of his water. Then he told them it was time. They stood up slowly, looked once more at the ground they were giving up, and began the walk down. The emotional weight of leaving was heavier than the physical exhaustion for many of them. These men had fought together through the beach and into the ridges. They had watched friends die and had carried others when they could barely carry themselves. Now they were being told to walk away while the fight continued. Some felt relief so strong it made them unsteady on their feet. Others felt a quiet guilt that they could not quite name. They had done everything that had been asked of them, and more. Still, walking away felt like abandonment, even when they knew it was necessary. As the last groups of Marines reached the beach area, the sight of the ships waiting offshore brought another layer of feeling. For some, the ships meant safety and rest. For others, they meant leaving behind men whose bodies could not yet be recovered. Small groups gathered near the water's edge while they waited for the landing craft. They spoke little. One Marine took off his helmet and poured the last of his water over another man's hands so he could wash some of the coral dust from a wound. Another shared a cigarette with a man who had none left. These were not grand gestures. They were the final small kindnesses offered between men who had already given everything else. When the landing craft finally came in, the Marines climbed aboard without ceremony. Some looked back at the island as the boats pulled away. Others kept their eyes forward. Harlan stood near the stern of one boat and watched the ridges grow smaller. He thought about the men who were still up there, the ones from the 81st who had taken their places, and the ones who would never leave. He thought about Lewis and the others who had been carried down ahead of him. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel failure. What he felt was something quieter and more complicated, the knowledge that they had done what was asked of them until they could do no more, and that mercy, when it finally came, had arrived wearing a uniform they had not expected. The boats moved steadily toward the larger ships waiting offshore. The men who had survived the ridges sat in silence or spoke in low voices about nothing that mattered. Behind them, the island continued to burn and smoke in places. The fight was not over. It had simply been taken from their hands. For the first time in weeks, they were no longer responsible for the next yard of ground. The weight of that realization settled over them slowly as the distance between the boats and the island grew. Just as these exhausted men discovered that even the strongest among them eventually reach a point where continuing is no longer possible, you can help keep these essential stories of courage and sacrifice alive with a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, to support the deep research, survivor accounts, and careful crafting that go into bringing forgotten history to light for new generations. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The ships took them away from the sound of the guns. The men who had been relieved sat with their backs against the bulkheads or lay on the decks and tried to let their bodies remember what rest felt like. Some of them would carry the ridges with them for the rest of their lives. Others would try to leave them behind with the island itself. All of them had reached the limit of what even the old breed could endure, and all of them had lived to see mercy arrive in a form they had not expected. The fight on Peleliu continued without them. For the first time in a long while, they were no longer part of it. The fresh faces that stepped into the ridges carried the same hope that every new unit brings to an old fight, the quiet belief that they might succeed where others had been worn down. The island did not care about hope. The soldiers of the 81st Infantry Division moved forward through ground that still smelled of cordite and death. They had been told the Marines had done the hardest work. They had been told the ridges were being reduced and that their job was to finish what had been started. Many of them believed it at first. They were rested, relatively speaking, and they had not yet spent weeks climbing coral that cut like glass or listening for movement in the dark. Their packs were still full. Their boots were not yet worn through. Their eyes had not yet taken on the hollow look that came from too many nights without real sleep. A young private named Miller was part of a company moving into a section of the Umbergal that the Marines had partially cleared. He walked with the careful steps of a man who had been warned about the terrain but had not yet felt it for himself. The coral under his boots was sharp and uneven. Every few steps he had to adjust his balance to keep from slipping. Around him, other men from his platoon did the same. They spoke little. The veterans among them, men who had already fought on Angaur, moved with more caution than the newer soldiers. They had learned that quiet ground on this island was rarely empty. When they reached the positions they were to take over, the handover was brief. A Marine sergeant showed them the best routes through the broken coral and pointed out the cave entrances that had already been partially sealed. He spoke in a tired voice, as if every word cost him something. Miller listened carefully. He noticed the way the Marine's hands shook slightly when he pointed, and the way his eyes kept drifting toward the higher ground as if expecting fire at any moment. When the sergeant finished, he simply nodded once and walked away without looking back. Miller watched him go and felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. The Marines were leaving. That should have felt like progress. Instead, it felt like they were being handed something the other men could no longer carry. The first night in the new positions was quiet in a way that made Miller nervous. He had expected more firing, more movement. Instead, there was only the occasional distant burst and the constant sound of the wind moving through the scrub. He sat in a shallow hole with two other men from his squad and tried to stay awake. One of them, a corporal named Reyes who had been on Angaur, kept his eyes on the dark ridgeline above them. He did not speak much, but when he did, his voice was low and steady. "They come at night," he said once. Miller nodded, though he was not entirely sure what they would look like when they came. They came before dawn. The first sign was a grenade that landed just outside their position. It exploded with a dull thud that sent fragments singing through the air. Miller pressed himself flat against the coral as another grenade followed. Then came the sound of movement, boots on loose rock, low voices in a language he did not understand. The Japanese had slipped close during the darkness, using the same routes the Marines had warned them about. Miller fired into the shadows when he saw movement, but he could not tell if he hit anything. Reyes was already moving, crawling to a better angle and returning fire in short, controlled bursts. The third man in their hole had been hit in the first moments. He lay still now, and Miller tried not to look at him while he reloaded. When the attack finally broke, the three men who remained in the position were breathing hard. Reyes checked the wounded man and shook his head once. Miller felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. This was not how he had imagined his first real fight on the island would go. He had pictured advancing, taking ground, doing the job they had been sent to do. Instead, they had been attacked in the dark by men who seemed to appear from nowhere and then vanish again. Reyes looked at him across the hole and said quietly, "That's how they fight here. Not like before." Miller nodded. He did not trust his voice yet. Over the next days, the men of the 81st learned the same lessons the Marines had paid for in blood. They learned that the caves were deeper and more connected than they had been told. They learned that sealing one entrance often meant the enemy would appear from another. They learned that the coral ridges could hide men until they were almost on top of you, and that fire from above could come from positions that seemed impossible to reach. Miller's platoon lost men in small, bitter fights that never made the maps look any different at the end of the day. They gained ground in inches. Every yard cost something. There were moments of unexpected humanity amid the grinding work. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult push toward a cave system, Miller found himself sitting with Reyes and two other men from the platoon. They had been ordered to hold a small ledge while engineers prepared charges to seal another entrance below them. The sun was brutal, and their canteens were nearly empty. One of the other men, a quiet soldier named Soto, had been hit earlier in the day. The wound was not immediately life-threatening, but it had left him weak. Reyes shared the last of his water with Soto without being asked. Miller watched the small gesture and felt something loosen in his chest. In the middle of all the death and exhaustion, men were still looking after each other in the only ways they could. The Japanese resistance did not break. It simply shifted. When one strongpoint was reduced with flamethrowers and demolitions, another would open fire from a different angle. The men of the 81st began to understand why the Marines had looked the way they did when they handed over the positions. This was not a battle that could be won with speed or with the kind of aggressive movement some of them had expected. This was a slow, methodical reduction of hidden positions that refused to stay hidden. Every sealed cave seemed to birth another problem somewhere else. The island was teaching them the same hard truth it had taught the men who came before: there was no easy way through this ground. Miller felt the change in himself as the days passed. The fresh confidence he had carried when he first stepped onto the island was gone. In its place was a more cautious, more watchful way of moving. He no longer assumed that silence meant safety. He no longer believed that taking one ridge would make the next one easier. He learned to listen to the veterans in his platoon the way he had once listened to training instructors. Reyes, in particular, became someone Miller watched closely. The corporal had a way of knowing when to move and when to wait that could not be taught in any classroom. Miller tried to copy it when he could. There were nights when the fear came back stronger than before. Miller would lie in his shallow position and listen to every sound, convinced that the darkness was full of men who knew the ground better than he ever would. On those nights, he would sometimes reach for the small photograph he kept in his pocket, a picture of his family that he had not yet shown to anyone on the island. He would look at it for a few seconds, then put it away again. The faces in the photograph felt farther away with every day he spent in the ridges. He did not know if he would ever be able to explain to them what this place had been like. As the 81st Division continued the slow work of reducing the remaining strongpoints, the men began to understand the true nature of the fight they had inherited. This was not a battle of dramatic advances or clear victories. It was a battle of persistence, of accepting that every gain would be paid for, and of learning to keep moving even when movement itself felt pointless. The Japanese defenders who remained fought with the same grim determination that had marked the entire campaign. They did not surrender positions easily. They made every attempt to clear them costly. The men of the 81st learned to respect that tenacity even as they fought against it. One evening, after another long day of cave reduction, Miller sat with Reyes and Soto on a narrow ledge. Soto's wound had been bandaged again, and he was able to sit up. The three men shared what little water they had left and spoke in low voices about nothing that mattered. For a few minutes, the ridges around them felt almost quiet. Miller looked at the two men beside him and felt a strange sense of belonging that had not been there when he first arrived. They had not chosen this ground, but they were on it together. That was enough for now. The pocket of despair the Marines had left behind was still there. The 81st Division had simply stepped into it. The fresh faces were learning, one painful day at a time, that some fights do not end when new men arrive. They only continue with different names and different bodies paying the price. The island had not changed. Only the men trying to take it had. Just as these soldiers discovered that inheriting a nightmare does not make it any less real, you can join a passionate community of history lovers on Patreon for exclusive and censored podcasts, raw unedited video segments, and deeper explorations into the human side of World War II, where you can connect with others who believe in preserving the full, honest truth. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The work in the ridges continued. The cave still breathed resistance. And the men who had come to finish what others had started were slowly becoming part of the same story, one careful step, one sealed entrance, and one quiet act of looking after each other at a time. The last voice that came from the underground command post was not a cry of defiance or a call for surrender. It was a quiet transmission confirming that the final positions were still held, and that the men inside would not be coming out. By the final days of the battle, the remaining Japanese strongholds had been reduced to a handful of interconnected caves in the heart of the Umurbrugol. What had once been a network of tunnels and firing positions was now a shrinking pocket of resistance. The Americans had brought flamethrowers, satchel charges, and bulldozers to the fight. They sealed entrances one by one, sometimes with men still inside. The Japanese who remained did not attempt to break out. They had been ordered to hold until the end, and most of them accepted that the end would come inside the coral. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had moved his command post deeper into the cave system as the outer positions fell. He was no longer directing a battle in the traditional sense. He was managing the final hours of men who had already accepted that they would not leave the island alive. Inside the main chamber, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cordite, and the wounded who could no longer be treated. Nakagawa sat with a small radio and a map that no longer reflected the ground above. He listened to the reports that came in from the remaining pockets and gave what instructions he could. His voice remained steady. The men around him drew what strength they could from that steadiness. One of the soldiers still with him was a young sergeant named Sato. Sato had been with Nakagawa's command for months. He had helped dig some of the tunnels they now sheltered in. He had watched men go out at night and not return. He had carried the wounded and buried the dead inside the caves when there was no other choice. Now he sat near the entrance to the command chamber with a rifle across his lap and listened to the sounds of the Americans working their way closer. Every so often a muffled explosion would shake the coral walls. Sato did not flinch. He had grown used to the sound of the world closing in. Nakagawa called Sato over late one evening. He handed him a small notebook and asked him to make sure certain messages were recorded if anything happened to the radio. Sato took the notebook without speaking. He knew what the messages would say. They were the final confirmations that the positions were still held and that the men inside would continue to resist. There would be no request for terms. There would be no signal of surrender. Nakagawa had been given his orders long before, and he intended to follow them to the end. Outside the caves, the American troops moved with grim determination. They had learned through bitter experience that the Japanese would not give ground easily, even when the fight was clearly lost. Small teams of engineers and infantrymen worked together to seal each remaining entrance. They used flamethrowers to burn out positions when direct assault was too costly. They listened for any sound of movement inside the caves before they committed charges. Some of the men had been on the island since the first day. Others had arrived with the 81st Division. All of them had seen enough death to know that this final phase was different. It was not about taking ground anymore. It was about ending the resistance in the only way the enemy seemed willing to accept. A lieutenant named Reed led one of the teams working near the main command cave. He had been on the island long enough to recognize the change in the fighting. The Japanese were no longer trying to harass or delay. They were simply holding. When his men called out for surrender, there was never an answer. Reed had stopped expecting one. He focused instead on keeping his team alive while they did the ugly work of closing the caves. One afternoon, after they had sealed an entrance that had been firing on them for hours, one of his men asked quietly if they should try again to offer terms. Reed looked at the sealed hole in the coral and shook his head. "They're not coming out," he said. The man nodded and went back to his work without another word. Inside the command cave, Nakagawa received the final reports from the remaining pockets. Most of them were brief. Positions overrun. Men still resisting in small groups. He acknowledged each message and told the operators to keep the radio ready. Sato watched him work and wondered what the colonel was thinking. Nakagawa had never been a man for speeches. He gave orders and expected them to be followed. Now, with the end so close, he seemed almost calm. Sato wondered if that calm came from acceptance or from something else, perhaps the knowledge that he had done what had been asked of him, regardless of the cost. The Americans reached the outer defenses of the command cave on what would be one of the final days of organized resistance. Reed's team moved carefully, using covering fire while engineers placed charges. There was a brief exchange of grenades and rifle fire from inside one of the entrances. Then silence. Reed gave the order to seal the position. As the charges detonated and the coral collapsed, he felt no sense of triumph. He felt only the heavy tiredness that had settled over everyone who had been on the island for any length of time. Another entrance closed. Another group of men who would not be coming out. Deep inside the main chamber, Nakagawa heard the explosions. He knew what they meant. The outer defenses were gone. The Americans were closing in on the command post itself. He sent one final message over the radio, confirming that the position was still held and that resistance would continue. Then he set the radio aside. Sato watched him and understood that there would be no more transmissions. Nakagawa stood for a moment, looking at the map one last time. Then he turned to the men who remained with him. He spoke quietly, telling them that they had done their duty and that the end was near. There was no dramatic speech. There was only the simple acknowledgement of what they all already knew. The final assault on the command cave came the next day. American engineers and infantry worked methodically, sealing the last accessible entrances and using flamethrowers on any position that still showed signs of life. Reed was there when the main chamber was finally reached. The fighting inside was brief and brutal. When it was over, the Americans found Colonel Nakagawa among the dead. He had taken his own life rather than be captured. Nearby lay several of his staff officers and soldiers who had chosen the same end. Reed stood in the entrance for a long moment, looking at the scene. He felt no satisfaction. He felt only the weight of what it had taken to reach this point. Outside, the news that the Japanese command post had fallen spread quickly among the American units still working in the ridges. Some men felt relief that the organized resistance was finally ending. Others felt a strange, quiet respect for the men who had fought so long and so completely from inside the earth. There was no celebration. The work of clearing the remaining pockets continued. There were still isolated groups of Japanese soldiers holding out in smaller caves, and the Americans knew better than to assume the fight was truly over. Sato did not live to see the final collapse of the command post. He had gone out with a small group the night before, attempting to reach another position that was still holding. They were caught in the open and cut down. His body was never recovered. The notebook Nakagawa had given him was lost with him. The messages it contained were never sent. Like so many others on both sides, Sato simply disappeared into the coral and the violence that had defined the island for weeks. In the days that followed the fall of the command post, the Americans continued the slow, dangerous work of reducing the last strongpoints. They found small groups of Japanese soldiers who fought until they could fight no more. They found others who had already taken their own lives rather than surrender. The cost on both sides had been enormous. The Americans had paid in thousands of casualties. The Japanese had paid with nearly every man who had been on the island. What remained was a quiet, exhausted recognition that the battle was ending in the only way it seemed it could, with almost no one left to claim victory. Reed walked through one of the cleared areas with two of his men after the command post had been secured. They moved carefully, even though the immediate danger had passed. One of the men stopped beside the body of a Japanese soldier who had been caught outside during the final fighting. He looked at the face for a moment, then covered it with a piece of cloth before moving on. Reed watched him do it and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The man had been an enemy, but he had also been a man who had fought and died in a place far from home. That fact did not change anything about the battle, but it stayed with Reed as they continued their work. The last radio from Nakagawa's tomb had gone silent. The men who had sent it were gone. The Americans who had fought to reach them were left with the ground they had taken and the knowledge of what it had cost. There was no parade, no moment of triumph. There was only the slow, heavy work of finishing what had been started and the quiet understanding that some fights end not with victory, but with exhaustion on both sides. Just as these final hours revealed the human cost of a battle that refused to end until almost no one remained to fight it, you can receive our free weekly newsletter packed with hidden histories and claim your complimentary copy of the ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top-Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, revealing the espionage, forgotten heroes, and behind-the-scenes decisions that changed the course of the war. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The ridges grew quieter as the last pockets were reduced. The Americans moved through the broken coral with the careful steps of men who no longer expected sudden violence at every turn. The island had given up its final organized resistance. What remained were the isolated men who would continue to fight alone until they could fight no more, and the living who would carry the memory of what it had taken to bring the battle to this point. The last radio had fallen silent. The tomb had been opened. And the men on both sides who had survived were left to reckon with what had been lost in the process. The guns had finally grown quiet, but the island had not finished speaking. It spoke now in silence and in the overwhelming presence of the dead. When organized resistance ended, the men who remained were given a new and terrible task. They were told to walk among the unburied thousands and begin the long work of bringing some order to what the battle had left behind. The ridges and draws that had been fought over for weeks were now quiet, but they were not empty. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Some had been there for days. Others had been there since the first landings. The coral ground made burial difficult. There were no soft fields to dig into, only hard, jagged rock that resisted every attempt to give the dead a proper resting place. A Marine named Harlan was assigned to one of the burial details that moved through the lower ridges in the days after the main fighting stopped. He had survived the beach, the ridges, the nights of infiltration, and the slow grind that had worn his unit down to almost nothing. Now he walked with a small group of men who had been given shovels, picks, and whatever cloth could be found to use as shrouds. They moved carefully, stepping around the dead rather than over them when they could. The smell was thick in the heat. It clung to their clothes and their skin and settled in the back of their throats. Harlan had seen death before. He had never seen it on this scale. They came first upon a group of Japanese soldiers who had been caught in the open during one of the final pushes. The bodies lay where they had fallen, some still holding their rifles, others with their arms thrown wide as if they had been reaching for something when they died. Harlan and the men with him worked in silence at first. They collected weapons and personal items when they found them, though there were not many. One of the younger Marines stopped beside a Japanese soldier who looked no older than he was. The dead man's face was peaceful in a way that seemed wrong after everything they had been through. The young Marine hesitated, then gently closed the man's eyes with his fingers before moving on. Harlan saw it but said nothing. There was nothing to say. Further along the slope they found American dead who had not yet been recovered. These were harder. Harlan recognized one of them as a man from another company who had been missing since the early days in the ridges. The body had been partially covered by loose coral that had shifted during the fighting. Harlan knelt beside him and removed the man's identification tags. He placed them carefully in a small pouch with the others they had already collected. Then he and two of the other Marines began the slow work of trying to dig a grave in the coral. The picks rang against the rock. Progress was slow. After an hour they had managed only a shallow depression. They wrapped the body in what cloth they had and placed it inside, then covered it as best they could with loose rock. It was not a proper burial. It was the best they could do. As they worked, Harlan found himself thinking about the men he had known who were now part of this landscape. He thought about Lewis, who had been carried down to the beach during the relief. He thought about others whose names he still carried in his mind even though he had not seen their bodies. Every dead man they passed was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. The scale of it pressed on him in a way the fighting itself had not. During the battle there had been no time to feel the full weight of what was happening. Now, in the quiet, the weight settled. They moved higher into the ridges as the day went on. The terrain grew more broken. In some of the draws the bodies were so thick that the men had to step carefully to avoid them. Japanese dead lay in clusters where they had made their last stands. American dead were more scattered, the result of the slow, costly advances that had defined so much of the fighting. Harlan noticed that many of the Japanese soldiers still had their weapons beside them. Some had clearly fought until the very end. Others appeared to have taken their own lives when capture became inevitable. He did not judge them. He simply registered what he saw and kept moving. One of the men on the detail, a private who had only recently joined the unit, stopped suddenly beside a Japanese soldier who had been lying with his arm outstretched. The dead man's hand was open, as if he had been reaching for something when he died. The young Marine bent down and picked up a small photograph that had fallen from the man's fingers. He looked at it for a long moment. It showed a woman and a child standing in front of a simple house. The Marine carefully placed the photograph back into the dead man's hand and closed the fingers around it. Then he stood up and continued walking. Harlan watched him do it and felt something shift inside his chest. In the middle of all this death, small acts of decency still mattered. They worked until the light began to fade. By then they had collected more identification tags than any of them wanted to count. They had wrapped and partially buried as many bodies as they could manage. The work was not finished. It would not be finished for days, perhaps weeks. Isolated Japanese soldiers were still being found in small caves and hidden positions. Some fought when they were discovered. Others had already taken their own lives. Each new discovery meant more bodies to confront, more names to record, more men to try to give some measure of dignity in death. That evening, Harlan sat with the other men from the detail near a small fire they had built in a sheltered spot. No one spoke much at first. The work had left them tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. One of the men finally broke the silence. He asked, quietly, why so many had to die for this place. No one answered him right away. Harlan looked into the fire and thought about everything he had seen since the first day on the beach. He thought about the ridges that had cost so much and given back so little in return. He thought about the men who were still unburied and the men who would never be found. Finally he said, I don't know. It was the only honest answer he had. The next day they went out again. The work was the same. The smell was the same. The quiet was the same. They moved through another section of the ridges, collecting what they could and trying to give the dead whatever dignity was possible in that broken ground. Harlan found himself pausing more often than he had the day before. He would stop beside a body and look at the face, or at the way the hands were positioned, or at the small personal items that sometimes remained. Each one was a story that had ended here. Each one was a life that had been asked to pay a price that now seemed impossibly high. In the days that followed, as more of the island was cleared, the burial details continued their work. They moved through areas where the fighting had been heaviest. They found Japanese dead in the hundreds in some of the deeper draws. They found American dead in smaller numbers but no less painful to encounter. The men on the details developed a kind of quiet rhythm. They worked without unnecessary words. They helped each other when the work became too heavy. They shared what little water and food they had. These small acts of looking after one another were the only thing that made the task bearable. Harlan kept a small notebook in which he recorded the names from the identification tags they collected. He did not know if the notebook would ever reach anyone who could use the information. He kept it anyway. It felt like something he could do. One evening, after a long day, he sat alone for a few minutes and looked through the names he had written. He did not recognize most of them. They were men from other units, other companies, other lives. Still, writing them down felt important. It was a way of saying that they had been here, that they had mattered, that someone had seen them at the end. The island slowly began to change as the burial work continued. The worst of the smell began to fade in the areas they had cleared. The bodies were no longer left where they had fallen. Some had been buried in shallow graves. Others had been moved to temporary collection points where more permanent arrangements could be made later. The living moved through the same ground they had fought for, but now they moved as men trying to make sense of what had been lost rather than as men trying to take one more yard. Harlan walked through one of the cleared ridges on what would be one of his last days on burial detail. The sun was setting, and the light turned the coral a soft gold. He stopped at the edge of a draw and looked down at the ground they had worked through that day. Bodies still remained in some of the harder-to-reach places, but the worst of the open ground had been addressed. He thought about the men he had buried and the men he had left behind. He thought about the ridges that had taken so much and given back so little. He thought about the question the young Marine had asked by the fire, why so many had to die here. He did not have an answer. He was not sure anyone did. What he had instead was the memory of the faces he had seen, both living and dead, and the knowledge that he would carry this place with him long after he left it. The unburied thousands had been given what dignity could be offered in the time and the ground available. The living who had walked among them would carry their own burdens forward. The island had been taken. The cost had been paid. And now, in the quiet that followed, the men who remained were left to walk through what was left and try to understand what it had all meant. Just as these men confronted the true scale of what had been lost after the fighting finally stopped, you can honor the legacy of the Pacific Theater by discovering authentic World War II memorabilia, books, and artifacts, or watching the epic film Midway on Prime Video, which captures the courage and chaos of these island campaigns in powerful visual detail. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The work continued for as long as it was needed. The men who walked among the dead did what they could with what they had. And when they finally left the island, they carried with them the memory of the unburied thousands and the quiet understanding that some prices, once paid, can never be fully measured. The island was declared secure, but the men who had taken it could not bring themselves to celebrate. The victory they had been promised tasted like something else entirely. When the last organized resistance was broken and the official word came down that Peleliu was in American hands, the reaction among the survivors was quiet and complicated. There were no cheers on the ships that carried the wounded away. There were no celebrations among the men still on the island finishing the grim work of clearing the last pockets. Instead, there was a heavy silence, the kind that settles when men have seen too much and paid too high a price for ground that now felt almost meaningless. A Marine named Harlan sat on the deck of a transport ship with what remained of his unit. His body was exhausted, but his mind would not rest. He had watched friends die in the surf on the first day. He had climbed the ridges under fire that never seemed to stop. He had walked among the unburied dead in the days after the fighting ended. Now, with the battle officially over, he found himself staring at the horizon and wondering what any of it had accomplished. The airfield they had been told was so important lay behind them, already being repaired by engineers. Harlan had heard rumors that it would not be used the way the planners had once imagined. He did not know if the rumors were true, but he had stopped believing that the reasons given for the battle matched the reality of what they had endured. Beside him sat Ellison, one of the few men from his original squad who had made it through. Ellison's leg wound had been treated, but he still walked with a limp and carried the quiet weight of everything he had seen. The two men did not speak much at first. They had learned during the fighting that words were often unnecessary between men who had shared the same hell. But as the ship moved farther from the island, Ellison finally broke the silence. He asked the question that had been forming in both their minds since the last shots faded. "Was it worth it?" he said quietly. Harlan did not answer right away. He looked back toward the dark shape of Peleliu on the horizon and then turned forward again. "I don't know," he said. "I keep trying to find a reason that makes sense, but I can't." The question spread in small conversations across the ships and among the men still working on the island. It was not asked loudly or with anger at first. It was asked in the low voices of men who were too tired to pretend anymore. Some spoke of the airfield and how little it seemed to matter now that the fighting was over. Others spoke of the ridges and how many lives had been spent taking ground that could have been bypassed. A few mentioned the rumors they had heard even before the landing, that higher commanders had questioned whether the island needed to be taken at all. These conversations were not acts of disloyalty. They were the natural result of men trying to make sense of what they had been through. On another ship carrying wounded, a young private named Miller lay on a stretcher and listened to two Marines talking nearby. One of them had lost an arm. The other had been hit in the chest but was expected to recover. They spoke about home and about what they would tell their families when they got back. Then the conversation turned to the battle itself. The man with the missing arm said he had heard that the Japanese on Peleliu had not been able to threaten the Philippines the way the planners had claimed. He said he had heard that another island, Ulithi, was already being used as the main base instead. Miller listened without joining in. He had not been on the island long enough to have strong opinions about strategy. But he had seen enough death to understand why the older men were asking these questions. The cost had been visible in every ridge and every draw they had fought through. Back on the island, burial details and mop-up teams continued their work while the official victory was announced. Harlan's detail moved through another section of the ridges, still collecting identification tags and trying to give the dead what dignity they could. One afternoon they came across the body of a Japanese officer who had been carrying a small notebook. Harlan opened it carefully. The pages were filled with careful handwriting in a language he could not read, but he could see dates and what looked like names. He closed the notebook and placed it with the other personal items they had collected. He did not know what the words said, but he understood that the man who had written them had been fighting for something he believed in, just as the Americans had. That thought stayed with him as they continued their work. The private anger and sorrow that began to surface among the survivors was not directed at the men who had fought beside them. It was directed at the distance between the reasons given for the battle and the reality of what it had cost. Some men wrote letters home that were more honest than the ones they had written during the fighting. They described the ridges and the heat and the nights when death could come from anywhere. They did not always say outright that they questioned the battle, but the doubt was there between the lines. Families receiving these letters would later piece together the same questions their sons and husbands were already asking on the ships and in the hospitals. Gold Star telegrams began arriving at homes across America while the survivors were still trying to make sense of what they had been through. A mother in Ohio opened her door to find a Western Union messenger and knew before she took the envelope what it contained. Her son had been one of the first to fall on the beach. She read the words carefully, then sat at her kitchen table for a long time without moving. In another town, a father received word that his only son would not be coming home. He read the telegram once, folded it, and placed it in the drawer of his desk. He did not speak of it for days. When he finally did, it was only to say that he hoped someone could explain why so many young men had been asked to die for a place that seemed to matter so little once the fighting was over. Among the survivors, the conversations grew more direct as the days passed. On one of the ships, a group of Marines who had fought together in the ridges sat on the deck and spoke openly about what they had heard. One of them said he had been told before the landing that the island could have been bypassed. Another said he had seen reports that the Japanese air power in the Palaus was not as strong as the planners had claimed. A third man, who had been wounded early and evaluated, listened without speaking. When the others finished, he said quietly that none of it mattered now. The men who were gone were gone. The only thing left was to try to live with what had been done. The others nodded. They did not argue with him. They simply sat in silence for a while, each man carrying his own version of the same bitter understanding. The label unnecessary did not appear in official reports or in the first dispatches that reached the newspapers. It began in these quiet conversations among the men who had paid the price. It grew in the letters they wrote and in the stories they would later tell. It was not a political judgment at first. It was a human one. These men had been told the island was vital. They had been told the fight would be short. They had been told their sacrifice would help win the war faster. Now, with the battle behind them, they were beginning to see that the cost had been higher than the gain. The airfield they had captured saw limited use. The larger campaign in the Philippines had moved forward without it playing the decisive role that had been promised. The men who had died in the surf and on the ridges had paid for a victory that felt smaller the farther they got from the island. Harlan received a letter from home while he was still on the ship. His wife wrote that she had heard the battle was over and that she was proud of him. She asked when he thought he might be able to come home. Harlan read the letter several times. He wanted to write back and tell her everything he had seen and everything he was now questioning. Instead, he wrote a shorter letter. He told her he was safe and that he was thinking of her. He did not mention the ridges or the dead or the conversations he was having with the other survivors. Some things were too heavy to put on paper. He folded the letter and gave it to the ship's mail clerk, then went back to the deck and looked out at the sea. The island was no longer visible. The questions remained. The bitter aftertaste of victory settled over the men in different ways. Some carried it quietly and tried to move forward with their lives. Others spoke about it more openly as the years passed. All of them understood something that the official reports could not capture: battlefield success and strategic value were not always the same thing. They had won the island. They had done what had been asked of them. But the cost had been so high, and the gain so uncertain, that the victory itself felt incomplete. The men who had died on Peleliu had not died in vain in the eyes of their comrades. But many of the survivors would carry, for the rest of their lives, the private belief that those deaths had not been necessary. Just as these men began to understand that victory on the battlefield does not always mean victory in the larger sense, you can uncover the raw, uncensored truth of what they endured through an exclusive digital collection of previously unseen photographs, personal letters, and restricted footage from Peleliu and other Pacific battles. Material too visceral and revealing for mainstream platforms. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The ships carried the survivors farther from the island with every passing day. The conversations continued in small groups and in quiet moments. The questions did not have easy answers. They never would. But the men who had fought on Peleliu had earned the right to ask them. They had paid for that right with blood and with the slow realization that some victories leave a taste that no amount of time can fully remove. The medals were pinned to chests and placed in drawers, but the memories did not stay where they were told. They lived on in quiet rooms long after the war was over, surfacing in the dark and in the spaces between ordinary days. The men who came home from Peleliu carried something that no ceremony could remove. They had survived the beach that first terrible morning, the ridges that cut like broken glass, the nights when death moved on quiet feet, and the long, grinding work of reducing caves that refused to stay silent. They had watched friends die in ways that did not make sense and had done things they would spend years trying to understand. When the ships finally brought them back to the United States, many expected that the worst was behind them. They discovered instead that the battle had followed them home in ways they could not have predicted. Eugene Sledge was one of those men. He had landed on Peleliu as a young Marine in K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. He had fought through the beach and into the ridges, enduring the heat, the thirst, the constant fear, and the terrible intimacy of close combat. When the battle ended, he was still standing, but something fundamental had changed inside him. Like many others, he tried at first to push the memories down and move forward with his life. He returned to Alabama and attempted to pick up the threads of the future he had imagined before the war. He enrolled in college and tried to focus on his studies. At night, however, the ridges came back. He would wake in the dark with the smell of cordite and coral dust in his nose, his heart pounding as if the Japanese infiltrators were still moving through the shadows outside his window. He learned quickly that the war did not end when the shooting stopped. It simply changed its form. Sledge was not alone in this struggle. Across the country, other survivors of Peleliu and the Pacific Campaign faced similar invisible wounds. Some men found that ordinary sounds, a car backfiring, a door slamming, could send them instantly back to the ridges. Others discovered that they could no longer sit with their backs to a room or sleep without a weapon nearby. Relationships that had once felt natural became difficult. Conversations with family and old friends often ended in silence because there were no words that could bridge the gap between what the veterans had seen and what those at home could understand. A Marine who had carried his wounded friend through the coral might sit at a dinner table and find himself unable to explain why he could not enjoy the meal in front of him. The ordinary world felt both too small and too loud at the same time. Many of these men received little help in the years immediately after the war. The condition that would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder was then known as combat fatigue or simply ignored. Families were told that time would heal what the battle had broken. For some men, time helped. For others, the memories only grew sharper with distance. Sledge found himself increasingly isolated, even among people who cared about him. He carried a deep sense of survivor's guilt that no amount of reassurance could ease. Why had he lived when so many better men had not? What right did he have to build a normal life when the ridges were still full of the dead he had left behind? These questions did not have answers, but they refused to leave him alone. In the quiet hours, Sledge began to write. At first it was not for publication. It was a way of trying to make sense of what he had seen and done. He wrote about the beach on the first day, about the way the water had turned red and the way men had fallen before they could even reach the sand. He wrote about the ridges and the heat and the nights when every sound carried the possibility of sudden violence. He wrote about the small acts of courage and kindness that had kept men going when everything else told them to stop. He wrote about the Japanese soldiers he had fought and killed, and about the strange, reluctant respect that had sometimes grown between enemies who shared the same terrible ground. Putting the words on paper did not take the memories away, but it gave them a shape he could begin to live with. Other survivors found their own ways of carrying what they had brought home. Some threw themselves into work or family life, trying to outrun the memories through sheer motion. Others withdrew, finding comfort only in the company of men who had been there and understood without needing explanation. A few turned to alcohol or other escapes, hoping to quiet the voices that spoke in the dark. There was no single path through the aftermath. Each man carried his own version of the ridges and had to find his own way of living with them. Sledge's writing eventually became something larger than personal healing. He realized that the story of what had happened on Peleliu and in the Pacific was in danger of being lost or softened into something more palatable. Official accounts often focused on strategy and victories. They rarely captured the raw, grinding reality of what the fighting had done to ordinary men. Sledge began to shape his notes into a book, determined to tell the truth as he had lived it. He wrote about the fear and the exhaustion. He wrote about the moments when men broke and the moments when they found unexpected strength. He wrote about the cost that no metal could measure, the nights that never ended, the faces that never left, and the questions that had no answers. When With the Old Breed was finally published years later, it gave voice to thousands of men who had never found the words themselves. Readers who had never been to war recognized something true in Sledge's account. Veterans who had lived through similar experiences found that someone had finally described what they had carried in silence for so long. The book did not erase the memories. Nothing could do that. But it gave those memories a place to rest outside the private darkness of individual minds. It preserved the reality of Peleliu in a way that official histories often could not. Other survivors continued their own quiet battles long after the war. Some never spoke of what they had seen. Others found ways to honor the dead by living as fully as they could. A Marine who had fought in the ridges might spend decades working with young people, trying to pass on the lessons he had learned about courage and endurance. Another might quietly visit memorials or keep in touch with the few men from his old unit who were still alive. These were not dramatic gestures. They were the ordinary ways men tried to carry forward the parts of themselves that the battle had not destroyed. The memories that no metal could erase shaped the lives of the survivors in ways both visible and hidden. They affected marriages and careers, relationships with children, and the ability to trust the world. They surfaced in unexpected moments, a smell, a sound, a certain quality of light, and they retreated again when they chose. Some men learned to live alongside their memories. Others spent their lives trying to outrun them. All of them understood, in ways that those who had not been there could never fully grasp, that the Battle of Peleliu had not ended when the last shot was fired. It had simply moved inside them, where it would remain for the rest of their lives. Sledge once wrote that the only way he could make peace with what he had seen was to tell the truth about it. That truth was not comfortable. It was not heroic in the way movies often portrayed war. It was the story of young men pushed to the edge of what humans could endure, and of what remained afterward. By putting that story on paper, he gave something valuable not only to himself but to everyone who would later want to understand what the battle had truly cost. The medals stayed in drawers. The memories did not. And through the honest telling of one man's experience, the reality of Peleliu was kept alive for those who would never walk its ridges but needed to know what had happened there. Just as these men carried the invisible weight of Peleliu long after the guns fell silent, you can help keep these essential stories of courage and sacrifice alive with a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1. to support the deep research, survivor accounts, and careful crafting that go into bringing forgotten history to light for new generations. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The years passed, and the survivors grew older. Some of them eventually found a measure of peace. Others continued to wrestle with what they had brought home. All of them had been changed by an island most people had never heard of and a battle that official accounts often treated as a footnote. The memories remained. They shaped the men who carried them, and through those men, they shaped the stories that would be told about the war long after the last veteran was gone. Peleliu had ended on the calendar. Inside the men who had fought there, it never truly ended at all. The island that once swallowed men whole now lies quiet under a tropical sun, its ridges softened by time and vegetation, yet still holding the stories that refuse to be forgotten. Peleliu today looks nothing like the battlefield the Marines and soldiers fought across in 1944. The coral that once cut through boots and skin is now partly covered by green growth. The beaches where so many fell are calm and empty except for the occasional visitor. Rusting tanks and landing craft rest where they were left, slowly being reclaimed by the sea and the jungle. Caves that once hid men determined to fight to the end now stand open, their entrances marked by small signs or left unmarked for those who know where to look. The island has become a place of pilgrimage for those who carry its memory, whether they were there themselves or are connected to it through blood and stories passed down through families. Veterans began returning to Peleliu not long after the war ended, though the journeys were difficult and rare at first. One Marine who had fought in the ridges came back decades later with his son. He walked slowly along the same ground he had once crossed under fire, stopping often to look at the coral formations that had once seemed so hostile. His son noticed that the old man's hands shook slightly when he touched a particular ledge. The veteran did not speak much during the visit. He simply stood in places where he had once lain flat while bullets snapped overhead, and he let the memories come. When they reached a small memorial near one of the ridges, he placed his hand on the stone and stood in silence for a long time. His son did not interrupt. He understood that some places still belonged more to the past than to the present. Other visitors came not as veterans but as descendants searching for pieces of their family's story. A woman whose grandfather had been killed on the beach during the first day arrived with her own children. She carried a faded photograph of the man she had never met and a letter he had written before the landing. She walked the beach slowly, trying to imagine where he might have fallen. When she reached a small marker that listed names of the fallen, she found his name and stood before it for several minutes. Her children stayed close but quiet, sensing that this moment belonged to something larger than themselves. Later, she wrote in a small notebook she had brought with her, trying to capture what it felt like to stand on ground that had taken her grandfather and changed the course of her family's life. She did not find easy answers. She found instead a deeper sense of connection to a story she had only known through fragments. Japanese visitors have also come to Peleliu over the years. Some are descendants of men who fought and died in the caves and ridges. Others are veterans themselves or family members seeking to understand what their fathers and grandfathers endured. One Japanese man whose father had been among the last defenders in the Umurbergal arrived with a small group of fellow pilgrims. He carried no anger, only a quiet determination to see the place where his father had spent his final days. When he entered one of the larger caves that had been partially cleared and preserved, he stood for a long time in the dim light. He did not speak of hatred or blame. He spoke instead of the young men on both sides who had been sent to this island and asked to do terrible things. Later, he met with an American veteran who had also returned. The two men, once enemies on this same ground, sat together near the beach and shared stories through translators. They spoke of fear and exhaustion, of small acts of humanity amid the violence, and of the strange bond that sometimes forms between men who have survived the same hell even if they were on opposite sides. Neither man pretended the past had been simple. Both seemed to find something valuable in simply being able to sit together and acknowledge what had happened here. The physical remnants of the battle remain visible for those who know where to look. Rusting tanks sit half buried in the sand or tangled in vegetation. Landing craft rest on the reef line where they were abandoned after delivering their loads of men into the fire. Caves still bear the marks of the fighting, charred walls from flamethrowers, collapsed sections from demolitions, and the occasional piece of equipment left behind when the last defenders were gone. Memorials have been placed at several locations, some by American veterans groups, others by Japanese organizations, and a few by the local people of Peleliu who have lived with the legacy of the battle for generations. These markers do not glorify the fighting. They simply note that men from both nations died here and that the island remembers. The work of making the island safe has continued for decades. Unexploded ordnance still lies buried in the coral and the jungle. Teams of specialists return periodically to locate and remove these remnants of the battle. The process is slow and dangerous. Every cleared area represents another small step toward allowing the island to exist without the constant threat of old violence surfacing unexpectedly. Local residents have learned to live with this reality. Children are taught from a young age to recognize dangerous objects and to stay away from certain areas. The battle that once defined Peleliu has become part of the island's daily life in quiet, practical ways. For many visitors, the most powerful moments come not from the large memorials or the famous sites, but from small, unexpected encounters with the past. A veteran might find a piece of coral that matches one he remembers from a particular fight. A descendant might discover a cave that matches a story her grandfather once told. A Japanese pilgrim might stand in a position and suddenly understand, in a way that no book could convey, what his father faced in those final days. These moments are rarely dramatic. They are quiet recognitions that this ground still holds memory, and that walking it can bring both pain and a measure of understanding. Reconciliation has taken many forms on Peleliu. Veterans from both sides have met and shared meals. Descendants have exchanged stories and sometimes even photographs of the men who fought here. Local people have welcomed visitors from both nations, offering hospitality and perspective that comes from living on an island that was once a battlefield and is now simply home. These encounters do not erase what happened. They do not pretend that the cost was anything other than what it was. Instead, they create space for people to stand together on the same ground and acknowledge the shared humanity of those who fought and those who died. The island that time almost forgot has become a place where memory is actively kept alive. It is not a museum in the traditional sense, though parts of it function that way. It is something more personal, a living connection between the past and the present, between those who were there and those who come later to understand. Visitors leave changed in small but meaningful ways. They carry with them not only stories of courage and suffering but also a deeper sense of what war actually costs and why honest remembrance matters. The ridges that once demanded blood now ask only that those who walk them listen to what the ground still has to say. Just as these pilgrims discover that some places hold memory more powerfully than any book or film, you can join a passionate community of history lovers on Patreon for exclusive and censored podcasts, raw unedited video segments, and deeper explorations into the human side of World War II, where you can connect with others who believe in preserving the full, honest truth. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The sun sets over Peleliu much as it did in 1944, but the island that once burned with violence now rests in a different kind of quiet. The caves stand open. The rusting equipment slowly returns to the earth. The memorials mark what was lost. And the people who come, veterans, descendants, pilgrims from both sides of the old battle, walk the same ground and carry away something that cannot be measured in strategy or victory. They carry the understanding that memory, when tended with honesty and care, can turn even the most terrible places into ground where healing and connection are still possible. The island that time almost forgot has not been forgotten after all. It simply asks those who visit to remember it well. The island has been quiet for more than 80 years, yet if you stand on its ridges when the wind moves through the coral and the light begins to fade, it still has something to say. Peleliu does not speak in the language of strategy or victory. It speaks in the quieter voices of the men who walked its beaches and climbed its broken ridges, and in the silence left by those who never came home. What it whispers is not a simple lesson that can be written on a plaque or summarized in a report. It is something more difficult and more necessary. It is the reminder that every decision to send young men and women into war carries a weight that cannot be measured only in ground taken or objectives achieved. The cost is measured in lives that never returned, and families that lived with absence for generations, and in the invisible wounds carried by those who survived. The men who fought on Peleliu were not abstractions. They were young Marines from small towns and cities across America who had already endured Guadalcanal or New Britain and still believed they could do what was asked of them. There were soldiers of the 81st Infantry Division who stepped into a fight that had already broken one of the toughest divisions in the Marine Corps. There were Japanese defenders who had been ordered to turn the coral into a tomb and who followed those orders with a determination that both horrified and, in some strange way, earned the reluctant respect of their enemies. Each of them had a name, a family, a life they hoped to return to. When we reduce them to numbers or to lessons in military history, we lose the very thing that makes their story matter. What Peleliu whispers most clearly is the danger of strategic miscalculation dressed in the language of necessity. Admiral Halsey had seen the intelligence and believed the island could be bypassed. The fast carriers had already shown that Japanese air power in the Palaus was not the threat it had once appeared to be. Yet the plan moved forward because momentum is difficult to stop once it has been set in motion, and because admitting that months of preparation might have been built on a flawed assumption required a kind of institutional courage that was in short supply. The men on the ground paid the price for that momentum. They paid it in the surf on the first morning, in the ridges that cut their hands and their boots, in the nights when death moved through their lines on quiet feet, and in the long, slow work of sealing caves that had been prepared for exactly this kind of fight. They paid it even after the battle was declared over, in the quiet years when the memories would not stay buried and when the question, was it worth it, had no satisfactory answer. The resilience of the human spirit under strain is another thing the island still speaks about. The Marines of the 1st Division did not break, even when their units were reduced to shadows of their former strength. They kept climbing. They kept carrying their wounded. They kept moving forward when every instinct and every piece of evidence told them the cost was too high. The soldiers of the 81st who took their places learned the same hard lessons in days rather than weeks, and they too kept going. On the other side of the lines, Japanese soldiers who knew they would not leave the island alive still moved through their tunnels at night, still held their positions, still chose to fight rather than surrender. There is no glory in that kind of endurance. There is only the stubborn, ordinary courage of men who decided that if they had to die here, they would do it in a way that honored the people they had left behind. That kind of courage does not erase the tragedy of the battle. It simply refuses to let the tragedy have the final word. The moral weight of remembering honestly is perhaps the clearest whisper Peleliu still offers. It is tempting to look back at this battle and see only the courage of the men who fought it. Courage was certainly present in abundance. But courage without honest examination of why it was required can become a kind of blindness. The men who survived Peleliu did not ask to be remembered as heroes in a simple story. Many of them spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what had been asked of them and whether it had been necessary. Eugene Sledge wrote his book not to glorify the battle but to tell the truth about what it had done to ordinary young men. Other survivors carried their memories in silence, unable or unwilling to speak of what they had seen. Their silence was itself a form of testimony. It said that some experiences resist easy explanation and that the true cost of war is often paid in places no camera can reach and in ways no metal can measure. What the island still whispers to us is a warning about the distance between those who make decisions and those who carry them out. The commanders who planned the operation and the political leaders who approved it would never set foot on the coral. They would never feel the heat or the thirst or the sudden terror of a grenade rolling into a foxhole at night. The men who did those things were asked to trust that the reasons given to them were sound. When that trust proved to be built on assumptions that were already being questioned at higher levels, the gap between decision and consequence became a chasm filled with graves. Peleliu is not the only battle in which this has happened. It is simply one of the clearest examples of how the human cost of strategic error can be hidden behind the language of necessity and momentum. The island also speaks of the strange, stubborn hope that can survive even the worst that war can do. The men who fought here did not fight only for victory or for orders. They fought for the man next to them. They carried wounded comrades when they could barely carry themselves. They shared the last of their water. They wrote letters home that tried to sound braver than they felt. They found ways to remain human in a place that seemed designed to strip humanity away. That capacity for connection and for small acts of decency under impossible conditions is not a small thing. It is one of the reasons the story of Peleliu still matters. It reminds us that even when larger purposes fail or prove flawed, the people caught inside those purposes can still choose to treat one another with dignity. There is one final thing the island whispers, and it is perhaps the most important. It asks us to weigh the true price of war before we commit our sons and daughters to it. This does not mean that war is never necessary. It means that the decision to go to war must be made with eyes open to the full cost, not just the cost that appears on maps or in briefings. It means listening carefully when experienced voices raise doubts. It means being willing to change course even when momentum and pride argue against it. It means remembering that every young man or woman sent into battle carries with them not only their own life, but the lives of everyone who loves them and everyone who will be shaped by their absence or their return. Peleliu was not the first battle in which these truths were visible, and it will not be the last. But it remains one of the clearest mirrors we have for examining how easily the human cost of war can be underestimated and how long that cost can echo through generations. The men who fought here did not ask to become symbols or lessons. They asked only to do their duty and to come home. Many of them did neither. What we owe them is not simply gratitude or remembrance, though both are necessary. What we owe them is the willingness to look honestly at what was asked of them and to carry that honesty forward into the decisions we still make about when and why young people are sent to fight. The ridges of Peleliu have grown quiet. The caves no longer echo with the sounds of battle. But if we listen carefully, the island still speaks. It speaks of courage and of cost. It speaks of mistakes that might have been avoided and of ordinary men who did extraordinary things even when the larger purpose was uncertain. And it speaks, most clearly of all, of the responsibility that belongs to every generation that comes after, to remember not only that battles were fought, but why they were fought, and at what price. Just as the men who fought on Peleliu carried the weight of that island long after they left it, you can receive our free weekly newsletter packed with hidden histories and claim your complimentary copy of the ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top-Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, revealing the espionage, forgotten heroes, and behind-the-scenes decisions that changed the course of the war. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The wind still moves across the coral. The light still changes on the ridges. And the story of what happened here continues to ask something of us. It asks us to be worthy of the courage that was shown and honest about the cost that was paid. It asks us to carry the memory forward not as a simple tale of victory, but as a complicated, necessary reminder of what war actually does to the people caught inside it. Peleliu has nothing left to prove. It is only this quiet, persistent question to offer those who are willing to listen. When we send our sons and daughters into battle, do we truly understand what we are asking of them? And are we prepared to live with the answer?